The drawing room of the modest townhouse in an unfashionable quarter of London was precisely the kind of space that reflected financial decline with devastating clarity. The furniture, once quality pieces, bore the marks of years of careful maintenance and hopeful repair. The wallpaper, which had probably been elegant in another decade, now showed water stains in one corner and fading in the patches nearest the windows. Everything spoke of a family attempting to maintain respectability, while poverty pressed in from all sides. Sophie Ashford stood at the window, though standing seemed too active a description for what she was doing. She was existing at the window, one hand resting against the glass that was cold even through the thin material of her glove. Outside, London moved with indifference to her existence. Carriages passed, people hurried about their business. The world continued with the kind of relentless momentum that made her feel increasingly like a ghost, present, but no longer participating. She was 22 years old, which seemed both impossibly old and heartbreakingly young, depending on what angle she viewed her life from. She had been 22 for nearly 3 years now, an age that she had entered assuming it would be temporary, a brief way station on the journey toward marriage and a proper future. Instead, it had become a kind of stasis, not quite young enough to be a debutante, not old enough to be a spinster, simply suspended in the particularly painful position of a woman whose family's financial collapse had erased her from society's consideration. Her mother entered the drawing room with the particular heaviness of someone who had been carrying a burden so long that she no longer remembered what it felt like to move without it. Margaret Ashford had once been a beautiful woman. Sophie could still see the architecture of that beauty in her mother's face, though the years of worry had rendered it into something else entirely. "Mr. Pemberton has arrived," her mother said, and Sophie heard in those 5 words the weight of years of desperation, the culmination of countless letters and subtle inquiries, the entire machinery of her mother's attempt to secure her daughter's future through the only mechanism available to women without money. Sophie turned from the window, and the movement seemed to require considerable effort, as though she was pulling herself out of deep water. She recognized the expression on her mother's face. It was hope and fear in equal measure, which was precisely the expression that preceded the most devastating disappointments. The solicitor, Mr. Pemberton, was a man of perhaps 60, with the kind of professional courtesy that suggested he had spent decades conveying both excellent and terrible news with identical demeanor. He carried a leather satchel, and he moved with the careful precision of someone who understood that he was the bearer of something significant. "Miss Sophie," he said, inclining his head in a manner that was respectful but not overly warm. "Mrs. Ashford, I have come with a proposal that I believe requires your immediate consideration." Sophie settled herself in a chair and folded her hands in her lap, a gesture of composure that had become automatic. She had learned over the past years to present an external appearance of calm regardless of what internal turbulence was occurring. It was a useful skill, though it often made her feel as though the real Sophie, the one who felt things intensely, was trapped behind glass, observing herself from a distance. "There is a gentleman," Mr. Pemberton began, opening his satchel and withdrawing a sealed letter, "of considerable standing and means, who has expressed interest in matrimony. He has specifically requested a woman of gentle birth, but without extensive social connections. He values discretion, intelligence, and an ability to manage a household with dignity." Sophie felt her mother's hand grip the arm of her chair, felt the surge of hope that accompanied these words. A proposal, a husband, a solution to the problem that her mother had been attempting to solve for 3 years. "The gentleman in question," Mr. Pemberton continued, "is Richard James Thorne, Duke of Meridian. He is 58 years old, a widower of 5 years, and possesses estates in both London and the country. His financial position is entirely sound. His reputation, while not without complication, is generally respectable." Sophie had heard the name before. The Duke of Meridian was not unknown to her, though she had never met him. He was known to be a man of consequence, a man who had been married for 30 years to his first wife, a man who had largely withdrawn from society following her death. She knew from the fragments of conversation she had overheard, when she was still a person whom society discussed, that he was older, that his marriage had been long, that his wife had died in a carriage accident. What she did not know was that he was considering marriage to a woman nearly 40 years his junior. "The Duke has indicated that he would wish the marriage to occur quietly," Mr. Pemberton said, "within a month of your acceptance. He has prepared a settlement that would ensure your mother's financial security for the remainder of her life." There would be a house in London, a position as Duchess, and all the attendant responsibilities of that role. Sophie heard these words as though from a great distance. A month. Marriage to a man she had never met. A man who could be her father. A man who had loved one woman for 30 years and was now seeking a new wife with the kind of practical calculation that suggested emotion was not the driving force. "What does he require of me?" Sophie asked, her voice sounding strange and distant in her own ears. "That you be a suitable duchess," Mr. Pemberton replied. "That you manage his households with competence. That you be discreet regarding certain matters. That you provide companionship and perhaps an heir, should such a thing be possible." The words hung in the air, and Sophie felt something break inside her chest. Not dramatically, not with great sound or sensation, but quietly, the way a glass breaks when it is set down too hard on a table. A proposal, a solution, a future that looked nothing like the future she had imagined when she was a girl of 19 before her father's death, before the financial collapse, before everything had disappeared except this, her mother's desperate hope and her own resignation. "May I have time to consider?" Sophie asked, though she understood that there was no real choice to consider. This was survival. This was the difference between her mother living in poverty and her mother having security. This was the difference between slowly fading into spinsterhood and having a position, a role, a place in the world. "The Duke has requested an answer within a week," Mr. Pemberton said, rising to depart. "I shall return for your response, Miss Sophie. I trust you will give this proposal the serious consideration it merits." After he had gone, Sophie returned to the window. Outside, London continued its indifferent movement. Inside, she felt herself beginning to grieve, not for the marriage itself, but for the youth that would be lost to it. A duke of 58, a man old enough to be her father, a man who had already lived a full life, who had loved and been loved, who was now seeking a wife the way one might seek a competent household manager. She did not yet understand that she was about to meet a man who would teach her that love did not have an expiration date, that partnership could exist across the seemingly impossible distances of age and experience, that what she believed she had lost to resignation might be discovered in the most unexpected form. The letter that arrived 3 days later bore the seal of the Duke of Meridian, and Sophie understood that this was a communication that required a response, not from her, but from Mr. Pemberton, who had requested that Sophie's acceptance be formalized as quickly as possible. She had not in those 3 days experienced the kind of dramatic emotional crisis she might have expected. Instead, there was a peculiar numbness, the numbness of someone who had been bracing for catastrophe for so long that when it actually arrived, it felt almost like relief. The waiting was over. A decision had been made, or rather, a decision had been made for her which amounted to the same thing. Her mother had wept, not from despair, but from gratitude. The tears had been complicated, containing within them relief, guilt for her gratitude, and some portion of genuine concern for her daughter. But they had also contained the recognition that this marriage would solve the fundamental problem that had consumed the past 3 years: poverty. "You must understand," her mother had said, holding Sophie's hands in her own trembling ones, "that this is a remarkable opportunity. The Duke is a good man. He would not mistreat you. And you will have security. You will have position. Your children, should you have them, will be secure." Sophie had listened to her mother speak of children and position and security, and she had felt the strange disconnection that had been her constant companion since her father's death. She was being offered a future, but it was a future that belonged to someone else, someone named Sophie, who was the Duchess of Meridian. The real Sophie, the girl who had played the pianoforte, who had dreamed of marrying a man she loved, who had believed that her youth was an asset rather than an embarrassment, that Sophie seemed to be fading away. The agreement that formalized their betrothal arrived with Mr. Pemberton, who explained the particulars in a voice that was professionally warm but emotionally neutral. There would be a settlement of £3,000 per annum for her mother to continue for the duration of her life. There would be a house in Grosvenor Square which Sophie would manage. There would be an estate in Derbyshire, Meridian Hall, which the Duke visited periodically, and which would require competent household management. There would be, the document stated with delicate euphemism, the expectation of marital relations with the goal of producing an heir. Sophie signed the document with a hand that was entirely steady. She had learned over the years of her family's decline how to perform competence even when internal chaos was occurring. She signed her name, Sophie Margaret Ashford, and understood that in doing so she was erasing herself entirely. In 4 weeks she would be Sophie Margaret Thorne, Duchess of Meridian. "The Duke has requested that you meet him before the wedding," Mr. Pemberton said, removing another document from his satchel. "He believes it would be wise for you to become acquainted before the ceremony. He suggests next Friday, in the drawing room of his London residence. He will send a carriage for you at 2 o'clock. Sophie nodded, accepting this arrangement, as she had accepted everything else. She did not ask whether the Duke was nervous, whether he was experiencing any uncertainty, whether he had any awareness of the woman he was about to marry beyond the dry particulars contained in the marriage agreement. These seemed like foolish questions, the kind that a woman with choices might ask. Sophie had no choices. She had only the forward trajectory of her life toward a future that was secure and utterly unknown. The day of the meeting arrived with the kind of ordinary weather that made the extraordinary nature of what she was about to do seem almost absurd. It was a Thursday afternoon in late spring, and London was bursting with the kind of vitality that comes when winter finally releases its grip. The streets were crowded with people engaged in the business of living, shopping, visiting, conducting the ordinary machinery of their lives. The carriage that arrived to collect her was elegant, but not ostentatious. The interior was upholstered in deep blue velvet, and the brass fittings were polished to a mirror shine. This was the carriage of a man of considerable means, but also a man of refined taste, who did not require constant demonstration of his wealth. Sophie sat in the carriage, her hands folded in her lap, and watched London pass. She wore her best dress, a gown of dove-grey silk that had been her mother's, carefully altered to fit her more slender frame. The color was appropriate for a woman in her position, not the black of mourning, but the restrained grey of someone who was not attempting to draw attention through fashion. The Duke's London residence was on Berkeley Square, in precisely the kind of location that spoke of old money and established position. The house itself was Georgian, elegant without ostentation, the kind of residence that had been passed down through generations and had accumulated the patina of genuine inhabitation rather than the polish of recent acquisition. A butler received her, a man of perhaps 60 with the bearing and manner of someone who had been managing a great household for decades. He conducted her to a drawing room that was neither too grand nor too modest, and she was left to wait. She waited for perhaps 10 minutes, though it might have been longer. Time had become a strange thing, operating at different speeds depending on her emotional state. She was aware of her heart beating more quickly than usual. She was aware of the tremor in her hands. She was aware that she was about to meet the man who would be her husband, and she felt utterly unprepared for this meeting, despite having spent the past week attempting to prepare. When he entered the drawing room, Sophie understood immediately why her mother had not been more alarmed by the age difference. The Duke of Meridian moved with the kind of presence that suggested age was merely a number, a factual detail, rather than a defining characteristic. He was tall, straight-backed, dressed impeccably in charcoal grey, with a waistcoat of burgundy silk. His silver hair caught the light from the windows, and his expression was one of courteous inquiry, tempered with something that might have been nervousness. "Miss Sophie," he said, inclining his head in a manner that suggested respect rather than condescension, "I am Richard Thorne. I trust you have received the documentation regarding our proposed marriage." "I have, Your Grace," Sophie replied, rising as was appropriate. "I have accepted the proposal." "Please," he said, "sit. I find that standing conversations can become unnecessarily formal, and I suspect this conversation would benefit from being somewhat less formal than the circumstances might otherwise dictate." Sophie resumed her seat, and the Duke settled himself in a chair across from her. He studied her with an expression of careful attention, and she felt that he was truly looking at her, not at the position she would hold, not at her utility as a means to produce an heir, but at her, Sophie Margaret Ashford, the young woman sitting before him. "You are very young," he said finally, and there was something in his tone that suggested this was not precisely a compliment. "Significantly younger than I anticipated, based on the descriptions I received. I am 22 years old," Sophie said, her voice remaining level. "I hope that is not a source of disappointment." "On the contrary," the Duke replied, "it is a source of considerable concern. Not concern regarding your suitability. The documentation regarding your background and education is excellent. Rather, concern regarding whether you understand what you are accepting. You are agreeing to become the Duchess of Meridian, to manage substantial estates, to assume a position that requires considerable responsibility. You are doing this at an age when most women are enjoying the pleasures of their first season, attending balls, being courted by men of their own generation. I want to understand whether you are accepting this marriage from genuine understanding or whether you are accepting it from necessity." Sophie found herself unable to answer immediately. No one, not her mother, not Mr. Pemberton, not anyone in her life had asked her this question. No one had suggested that her acceptance might be anything other than appropriate gratitude for an extraordinary opportunity. "I accept this marriage from both necessity and understanding," she said finally. "My family's circumstances are such that this marriage is necessary, and I understand the responsibilities that will accompany my position. I do not deceive myself that this is a marriage of affection. I understand that you are seeking a wife to manage your households and bear your heir. I understand that I am young enough to accomplish both of these things. I accept all of this." The Duke regarded her for a long moment, and she saw something shift in his expression, a flicker of something that might have been sadness, or might have been admiration for her honesty. "That is precisely the kind of clarity I hoped you would possess," he said finally. "You are correct that this marriage is not one based on romantic affection. However, I would hope that we might build something that resembles genuine partnership, that we might treat each other with respect and consideration, that we might create a household that functions not merely from obligation, but from a certain degree of mutual regard. Can you accept those terms?" "I can," Sophie said, and she meant it. "Then we shall be married in 4 weeks," the Duke said, "and we shall attempt to create something that is, at minimum, a dignified partnership between two people who have been thrown together by circumstance." The week preceding her wedding was perhaps the strangest period of Sophie's life, a time in which she was transforming from one person into another, but the transformation was occurring externally while she remained, internally, entirely herself. New gowns arrived from an exclusive modiste, gowns in colors and styles appropriate for a duchess. A jeweler came to fit her with pieces from the Meridian collection, including an engagement ring of exceptional quality that seemed almost obscene in its opulence. Invitations were sent to select members of society, announcing the marriage as a fait accompli rather than an event that might be discussed or speculated about. Her mother moved through this week in a state of tremulous joy. She had been fitted with new clothing, modest but elegant pieces appropriate for the mother of a duchess. She spent her evenings attempting to instruct Sophie in the particulars of household management, but Sophie sensed that these instructions were as much for her own benefit as for Sophie's. Her mother had been a woman of some position before her husband's death, and she was reclaiming a sense of purpose and identity through the preparation for her daughter's elevated status. The one person who remained largely absent was the Duke. He had visited once more briefly to ensure that Sophie had all necessary documentation regarding the estates and the household staff. He had also informed her that his sister, Lady Elizabeth Hartwell, would be at Meridian Hall to oversee the initial transition and to ensure that the household arrangements met with appropriate standards. "My sister," he had said with a tone that suggested this required explanation, "is a woman of considerable opinions regarding the proper management of estates and households. I trust you will find her suggestions valuable, though I advise you not to permit her to entirely dictate matters of your own preference. She has managed my household since my wife's death, and while she has done so with competence, there is a certain severity to her approach that I believe would benefit from your influence." Sophie had listened to this warning and had understood that she was being prepared, as gently as possible, for difficulty with her new sister-in-law. She had not expressed alarm at this. She had learned over the years of her family's decline that difficulties were simply part of the machinery of life. One encountered them, one managed them, one continued forward. The wedding itself occurred on a grey morning in late May, at the church nearest to Meridian Hall. The ceremony was quiet, as the Duke had indicated it would be. There was no grand procession, no society event designed to demonstrate the couple's social prominence. Instead, there was a small gathering of the Duke's closest friends, his sister, her husband, and Sophie's mother. There was the vicar, who conducted the service with appropriate solemnity. And there were Sophie and the Duke, standing before the altar and making vows that bound them to each other with the kind of legal and social permanence that made the actual emotional content of those vows almost irrelevant. Sophie remembered very little of the ceremony itself. She remembered the weight of her mother's hand gripping hers before the ceremony, remembered the feeling of the Duke's hand at her elbow as he guided her to the altar, remembered the careful precision with which he had spoken his vows. She remembered, most significantly, the moment when he placed the wedding ring on her finger, a band of gold that seemed to weigh far more than its material composition would suggest. After the ceremony, there was a breakfast conducted in the dining room of Meridian Hall. Sophie found herself sitting at the foot of a table with the Duke at the head, a symbolic arrangement that made clear the hierarchical nature of their relationship, even as they were being congratulated on their union. Lady Elizabeth watched her with an expression that was not precisely hostile, but which was certainly evaluating. She was a handsome woman, severe in her bearing, with the kind of composed expression that suggested she was making minute judgments about everything she observed. Her husband, Lord Hartwell, seemed like a pleasant enough man who had long since ceased to have opinions about anything and simply accepted his wife's determinations as law. "The East Wing will require your attention," Lady Elizabeth informed Sophie after the breakfast was concluded and the formal celebration had begun to disperse. "The curtains are in the most deplorable state, and the carpeting has not been replaced in 7 years. I have attempted to suggest these improvements to the Duke, but he seems to believe that such matters are of minimal importance." "I shall examine them," Sophie replied, her manner appropriately deferential but not submissive. She had learned in this strange week of preparation that deference without backbone was viewed as weakness, even by those who professed to value obedience. "You will also wish to review the account books," Lady Elizabeth continued. "The steward maintains them adequately, but there are opportunities for economies that have been overlooked. Women's intuition regarding such matters is frequently superior to men's careful calculations." Sophie nodded, accepting this assessment without comment. She was beginning to understand that her role was not merely to be the Duke's wife, but to be the counterbalance to his sister's authority, to serve as a polite but firm reassertion of the Duke's will within his own household. That evening, after the guests had departed and the household had been settled for the night, Sophie found herself alone in the Duchess's chambers for the first time. The room was beautiful, elegantly appointed with the kind of understated luxury that suggested old money and refined taste. There was a dressing table with an extensive collection of cosmetics and hair ornaments. There was a bed that seemed almost comically large for one person, and there was a door that connected to the Duke's chambers, a detail that brought her suddenly, viscerally, to the reality of what she had agreed to. She heard him come in, heard the quiet sound of his valet departing, the soft closing of a door. She sat on the edge of the enormous bed and waited, not knowing precisely what she was waiting for, knowing only that she had bound herself to this man, and that some completion of that binding was expected to occur. When he entered, he was wearing a dressing gown of fine wool, and he looked at her with an expression that was both tender and uncertain. "I want to explain something," he said, remaining at a respectful distance. "Our marriage is, as we have discussed, a practical arrangement. However, I have no intention of exercising my husbandly rights on our wedding night in a manner that would cause you distress. We shall have time to become acquainted. We shall have time to develop whatever understanding between us might be possible. But tonight, I think we should simply rest." Sophie felt something shift inside her chest, not quite relief because she had not been precisely afraid, but something like the release of tension that she had been holding without recognizing it. "Thank you," she said quietly. "There is nothing to thank me for," the Duke replied. "It is simply the approach that seems appropriate given our circumstances. However, I would ask that you permit me to know you, not in the physical sense, but in the deeper sense. I would ask that you not simply perform the role of Duchess, but that you share with me gradually who you actually are. Can you do that?" Sophie looked at this man, this gentleman who was old enough to be her father, who had loved another woman for 30 years, who was now asking her something that went far beyond the surface-level politeness of their arrangement. "I believe I can," she said finally, "though I confess I am uncertain who I actually am. I have been performing roles for so long that I have begun to lose sight of what lies beneath them." "Then perhaps," the Duke said with what might have been the faintest smile, "we might discover together who you are. That seems like a worthwhile project for a marriage." He withdrew to his own chambers, leaving Sophie alone with her thoughts, and she found herself experiencing something unexpected, gratitude for the gentleman who was her husband, and the first faint stirrings of hope that this marriage, which had begun as desperation, might become something more than merely survivable. The weeks following the wedding established a pattern that neither Sophie nor the Duke had anticipated, but which both seemed to find satisfactory. They began to exist as genuine partners, rather than mere roommates united by legal necessity. In the mornings they would breakfast together, during which the Duke would discuss the business of managing the estates with a patience that suggested he was genuinely interested in Sophie's observations and opinions. In the afternoons, they would sometimes walk the grounds of Meridian Hall, during which time the Duke would share stories of his life, carefully selected anecdotes that demonstrated how he had arrived at his current understanding of responsibility, duty, and partnership. What became increasingly clear to Sophie was that this man was not the cold, calculating gentleman who had proposed to her through his solicitor. Instead, he was a man of considerable warmth, intelligence, and depth. He had loved his first wife with genuine devotion. He spoke of her sometimes, always with the tenderness of someone recalling something precious that was no longer accessible, and he had, it seemed, been profoundly lonely in the 5 years since her death, not in a romantic sense, but in the fundamental human way that comes from the absence of someone who knew you completely. "I did not expect to marry again," he told her one afternoon, as they sat in the library of Meridian Hall. It was a beautiful room, lined floor to ceiling with books, and the walls were painted a deep green that seemed to absorb and transform the light. "When Eleanor died, I believed that my life in that particular dimension was complete. I had loved, been loved in return, built a partnership that lasted 3 decades. It seemed not merely arrogant but almost disloyal to imagine repeating that experience with someone else." Sophie listened to him speak of his first wife. Eleanor had been her name, and she had apparently been a woman of considerable accomplishment and warmth. Sophie found herself not jealous of this predecessor, but rather grateful to her for having shaped the man that Sophie was now married to. The person sitting beside her was a man who understood love's depth, who knew how to build partnership, who possessed the kind of emotional maturity that comes from having genuinely loved and been genuinely loved. "And now," Sophie asked, "do you still feel it would be disloyal?" "I have come to understand that loyalty to Eleanor's memory does not require me to remain a widower," the Duke said thoughtfully. "What I owed to her was the honoring of the time we had together, the recognition of its significance. That can be done while still being open to connection with another person. You are not Eleanor. You could never be Eleanor. But you are Sophie, and Sophie has become someone I find myself increasingly valuing." It was not a declaration of love, but Sophie found it more meaningful than any romantic hyperbole could have been. It was acknowledgement, recognition, genuine regard. The area that remained most challenging was Sophie's relationship with Lady Elizabeth. The Duke's sister seemed determined to ensure that Sophie understood exactly how inadequate the younger woman was, how much she had to learn, how superior Elizabeth's management of the household had been to anything Sophie might accomplish. Yet gradually, Sophie began to recognize the pattern underlying Elizabeth's criticism. It was not cruelty for cruelty's sake, but rather a woman defending her own position and identity. For 5 years, Elizabeth had been the mistress of Meridian Hall. She had occupied the position of authority that Sophie now held, and Sophie's arrival was a displacement, however graceful, of Elizabeth's role. It was the Duke who finally helped Sophie navigate this dynamic. One evening, after Elizabeth had made a particularly cutting remark regarding Sophie's suggestion for reorganizing the linen closet, the Duke had turned to his sister with unusual firmness. "Elizabeth," he said quietly, "I will not tolerate further undermining of Sophie's authority within this household. You have managed Meridian Hall with considerable competence, and your contributions are valued. However, Sophie is now the Duchess, and these estates are now her responsibility. You may advise, you may suggest, but you will not dictate, and you will not attempt to demonstrate that you could manage these responsibilities better than she can." What surprised Sophie was not his defense of her, but rather the fact that Elizabeth actually seemed relieved by the correction. The tension that had characterized their interactions seemed to ease somewhat, and Elizabeth began to acknowledge Sophie's management decisions with at least a veneer of support rather than veiled criticism. It was approximately 2 months into the marriage that the Duke approached Sophie with a delicate matter. They were in the conservatory, a space that had become their refuge, a place of plants and light and relative privacy from the constant machinery of a great household. "I wish to discuss the matter of heirs," he said, and Sophie felt her body tense automatically. This was the practical reason for their marriage, the purpose that had justified the union to society. "However, I also wish to understand whether you are prepared for this development. We have been married for 2 months. You have begun to become acquainted with your role. I do not wish to rush this process." Sophie considered the question carefully. 2 months had transformed her from a woman resigned to her circumstances into something approaching contentment. She had begun to take genuine interest in the management of the estates. She had begun to experience unexpected moments of genuine pleasure in the Duke's company, and she had begun to grieve less for her lost youth and to recognize that youth was perhaps less valuable than she had believed it to be. "I believe I am prepared," she said finally. "Though I confess uncertainty regarding the particulars, my mother provided minimal instruction in such matters, and I have little experience upon which to draw." "Then permit me to explain," the Duke said, with the kind of gentle patience that made the discussion something other than the clinical transaction it might have been. He spoke to her with respect, with consideration for her nervousness, and with the kind of specific attention to her potential concerns that suggested he had thought carefully about how to approach this subject with her. That night, their marriage was consummated, not with the kind of passionate intensity that novels sometimes suggested, but with care and attention and a surprising degree of tenderness. The Duke was conscious of her inexperience and her potential anxiety. He moved slowly, asked her repeatedly if she was comfortable, seemed more concerned with her well-being than with his own pleasure. Afterward, as Sophie lay in the darkness beside him, she found herself experiencing something unexpected. Gratitude. Not the cold gratitude of someone who had received charity, but genuine appreciation for a man who had shown her consideration, who had recognized her fear and addressed it with kindness, rather than with the kind of entitlement that some men might have exercised. "I am grateful," she said quietly, "that you are the husband I received. It would have been simple for you to be cruel or indifferent, or to exercise the rights that your position grants you, without consideration for my experience or comfort. I will not be cruel to you," the Duke said, and there was absolute certainty in his voice. "That is not a promise I will make and then break. That is a fundamental aspect of who I am. You are now my wife, which means that your well-being is my concern, not in the sense of possession, but in the sense of genuine care." Sophie fell asleep that night, with the unexpected realization that perhaps she had not lost her youth so much as she had been granted an opportunity to become something else, something more substantive than mere beauty or charm or the superficial attributes that society valued in young women. She had become a duchess, yes, but more importantly, she had begun to become herself. By the 5th month of her marriage, Sophie had begun to understand something fundamental about the Duke that fundamentally altered her perception of their union. He was not simply an older man who had sought a younger wife out of desire for beauty or youth. He was a man who had, at some level that he may not have fully acknowledged even to himself, recognized in her a kind of reflection of his own understanding, a person who had learned to make themselves small, to accommodate others' needs and preferences, to exist rather than fully live. And his intention, she gradually came to understand, was to teach her otherwise. This revelation came not through grand gestures or explicit declarations, but through 1,000 small moments. When she hesitated to express an opinion regarding the management of the kitchen gardens, he waited patiently until she offered it, then listened, as though her thoughts were genuinely valuable. When she remained silent during a conversation with guests, he would gently draw her into discussion, creating space for her voice. When she apologized for taking up too much of his time, he responded with amused firmness that her time was precisely as much as he wished it to be. It was Lady Elizabeth, surprisingly, who made this explicit one afternoon in early autumn. "My brother loves you," she said without preamble, finding Sophie in the library where she was reviewing household accounts. "I suspect you do not yet fully understand this, but he does. He is not a man given to impulsive declarations or romantic sentiment. My first husband was such a man, and it was exhausting. But Richard's love is steady, intentional, and entirely genuine. I see it in the way he observes you when you are not aware that he is looking. I see it in the way he has begun to defer to your judgment regarding matters that previously he would have decided himself. He has given you a remarkable gift, the gift of his genuine regard." Sophie set down her pen and regarded the Duke's sister with an attention she had not previously afforded her. "Why are you telling me this?" she asked. "Because I have been ungenerous to you," Elizabeth replied, settling herself in a chair across from Sophie's. "Because I was afraid that you would displace me entirely. Afraid that your youth and novelty would make Eleanor's memory fade, afraid that I would become irrelevant to my brother's life. These were failures on my part, born of my own insecurity. But watching how you have transformed in these months, watching how you have begun to believe in your own value, I have come to recognize that my brother was correct in his selection of you. You are not Eleanor. You will not be Eleanor. But you are becoming a woman of considerable worth, and you will be the source of genuine happiness to my brother." What struck Sophie most powerfully was that she believed this assessment. Over the past months, she had experienced a transformation that she could only describe as becoming. She had begun to express opinions without apologizing for them. She had begun to make decisions regarding the estates with growing confidence. She had begun to recognize that her youth, which she had viewed as a liability in comparison to the Duke's age and experience, was in fact an asset. It meant she had time to learn, to grow, to develop into her full potential. That evening she shared Elizabeth's words with the Duke as they sat together in the drawing room. She watched his expression shift, saw something that might have been surprise, definitely was pleasure, might even have been the kind of profound relief that comes from having something acknowledged that one has not dared to speak aloud. "My sister is perceptive," he said finally, "and she is correct, though I confess I have not permitted myself to examine too closely my feelings regarding you. I selected you from necessity. I required a wife and you required a marriage, but over the past months something has shifted in my understanding. I have come to value your company not because it serves a purpose, but because it brings me genuine pleasure. I have come to look forward to our conversations. I have come to take profound interest in your development and growth." He rose and moved to where she was sitting, and he extended his hand to help her to her feet. "I believe," he continued, "that we have built something that transcends the practical arrangement that initiated it. I believe that we have developed genuine partnership, and I wonder whether you might be willing to acknowledge this with me, not necessarily in grand declarations, but in the everyday reality of our commitment to each other." Sophie took his hand and found herself drawn to her feet, closer to him than they typically stood when engaged in serious conversation. She was acutely aware of their differences, his age, his experience, his assured position in the world. But she was also aware that these differences no longer represented a gulf between them. They represented, instead, a complementarity that was creating something neither of them could have anticipated. "I believe you are correct," she said quietly. "When I accepted your proposal, I accepted it from desperation and necessity. I did not believe that genuine feeling between us was possible. I believed that age and experience made such a thing unlikely, perhaps impossible, but I have come to understand that I was wrong. Over these months, I have come to value you, not as a benefactor, not as the source of my security, but as a person, as the man who has shown me that I am capable of growth, of mattering, of being valued for myself rather than for my utility." She paused, gathering courage for words that felt too vulnerable to speak aloud. "I have come to love you," she said finally. "Not the love I imagined in my girlhood, dramatic and overwhelming and based on romantic fancy, but something more genuine, more substantive. The love of a woman who has come to recognize that her partner sees her, knows her, and values her for who she actually is." The Duke drew her close, and Sophie felt his arms around her, not as a demand for physical intimacy, but as an affirmation of connection. She rested her head against his chest and heard his heart beating, strong and steady, and understood that she had been mistaken. She had not lost her youth. She had found something far more valuable, a life worth living. "I love you," the Duke said, his voice carrying the kind of conviction that suggested this was not a statement made lightly. "You have given me an unexpected gift, the gift of discovering that love, genuine love, is not a finite resource that is consumed when the first great love of one's life comes to an end. You have taught me that a man can love multiple times in his life, that partnership can deepen and transform, that the second great love can be as profound as the first, merely in a different form. Thank you for teaching me this." Outside, autumn had arrived in full force. The gardens of Meridian Hall were transforming into colors of gold and red and bronze. Inside, in the warm glow of candlelight, Sophie and the Duke stood together, two people whose lives had been forever altered by a proposal born of necessity and which had become something infinitely more valuable. Genuine partnership, authentic love, and the recognition that the greatest transformations in life often come from the most unexpected sources. Winter arrived at Meridian Hall with the kind of sudden intensity that transformed the landscape from autumn's copper richness into stark beauty. The trees were bare, their branches like delicate tracery against grey skies. The gardens that Sophie had come to love were reduced to their fundamental architecture, hedges, pathways, the skeleton of what would bloom again in spring. It was a landscape that seemed to mirror her own internal transformation, all the decorative elements stripped away, revealing something more essential beneath. It was during this season of barrenness and cold, that Sophie discovered she was pregnant. She had suspected for several weeks, the subtle signs that her mother had carefully explained to her before the wedding had begun to accumulate. The tenderness in her breasts, the subtle shifts in her appetite, the peculiar fatigue that seemed to grip her in the afternoons, despite having slept well the night before. But it was not until Dr. Ashworth, summoned by the Duke for a routine examination, had confirmed the fact that she permitted herself to fully acknowledge it. She was carrying the Duke's child. The revelation brought a complexity of emotions that she had not anticipated. Joy, certainly. The knowledge that she was creating life, that she was becoming a mother, was profound and transformative. But alongside the joy was fear. Fear of the physical ordeal that would accompany childbirth, fear of the vulnerability of carrying another person's life within her own body, fear of the ways that this would complicate her still developing relationship with the Duke. The Duke's reaction to the news was one of profound tenderness, tempered with evident concern. He had taken her hand when she shared the information, and she had seen moisture gather in his eyes. Not sadness, but something more akin to awe. "You have given me an extraordinary gift," he had said quietly. "Not merely the child, though that is remarkable, but the trust required to bring a child into existence, the vulnerability of your body, the risk to your health, the willingness to undergo an experience that carries genuine danger. This is perhaps the most profound expression of partnership possible." He had then, with characteristic thoughtfulness, summoned Dr. Ashworth and engaged him for monthly consultations throughout her pregnancy. He had also, with less characteristic impulsiveness, declared that Sophie should rest whenever she felt fatigued, that her comfort was now a matter of household priority, that he would personally oversee any dietary requirements that might support her well-being. The announcement of the pregnancy to the household staff had been met with appropriate celebration. The servants, who had been cautiously accepting of Sophie throughout the fall months, seemed to genuinely welcome the news. A child would ensure the Duke's succession, would provide the estate with its future master or mistress, would validate Sophie's position as Duchess in a way that even her proven competence in household management had not quite accomplished. What surprised Sophie most profoundly was Lady Elizabeth's response. The Duke's sister had arrived at Meridian Hall for the Christmas season, as was apparently her custom, and had been informed of the pregnancy almost immediately. "My dear," Elizabeth had said, embracing Sophie in a gesture of genuine warmth that would have been unthinkable 6 months previous, "you have accomplished in a single season what I began to despair would ever occur. You have given my brother not merely a wife, but a sense of purpose and future that I feared had died with Eleanor, and now you carry his child. This is extraordinary." The two women had sat together in the small drawing room, and Elizabeth had shared with Sophie the story of the Duke's first marriage, not the sanitized version that Sophie had heard, but the full complexity of a partnership that had been genuine, but had also been, in its own way, emotionally contained. Eleanor had been a woman of considerable accomplishment and social grace, but she had also been a woman who had been raised to believe that emotional expressiveness was unseemly, that a woman's role was to support and facilitate rather than to actively participate in the shaping of family life. "Richard loved her deeply," Elizabeth had said, "but he was never quite able to access the fullest parts of himself with her. They were partners, but they were also somewhat formal with each other, even after 30 years of marriage. What I observe between you and my brother is different. It is warmer, more genuine, more fundamentally alive. You have awakened something in him that I had believed was dormant, and in return he is providing you with something that I suspect you desperately needed, genuine recognition of your worth." As Christmas approached, Sophie found herself experiencing the season with an intensity that surprised her. The traditions of Meridian Hall, the decoration of the Great Hall with evergreen and gold ribbon, the commissioning of the massive Yule log, the preparation of the elaborate Christmas feast, all took on new meaning. She was not merely observing these customs, she was becoming their custodian. She was the woman who would pass these traditions to her children, who would shape the character of future generations through the choices she made in this present moment. The Duke's gift to her on Christmas morning was a journal, bound in soft leather of a pale blue that matched her eyes, with her initials embossed in gold on the cover. Inside, the first page bore a handwritten inscription in the Duke's careful script: "For Sophie, who has transformed my understanding of love, partnership, and the infinite possibilities of human connection. May you record within these pages the thoughts and feelings that create the interior landscape of the woman you are becoming." with profound regard and deepening love, Richard. Sophie had wept when she read this, not from sadness but from the overwhelming recognition of being truly seen and valued by another person. She had spent her entire young adult life attempting to make herself smaller, to take up less space, to apologize for her mere existence. And now she was being asked explicitly and with genuine intention to document her own growth, to recognize her own thoughts and feelings as valuable enough to record. She had begun writing that very evening, documenting not merely the facts of her days, but the internal landscape of her experience, her fears regarding the pregnancy, her hopes for the child she was carrying, her gratitude for the unexpected partnership she had discovered with the Duke, her recognition that what she had believed would be a life of resignation had become instead a life of genuine growth and possibility. On Christmas night, as she lay in the Duke's arms in their shared bed, she had shared with him some of what she had written. He had listened without interruption, and when she had finished, he had held her close and whispered words of love and appreciation into the darkness. "You are becoming the woman you were always meant to be," he had said, "and I have the extraordinary privilege of witnessing this transformation. Thank you for permitting me to be part of your journey." Outside, snow had begun to fall, silent and thick, transforming the landscape of Meridian Hall into something that seemed almost unreal in its beauty. Inside, Sophie had rested in the warmth of her husband's embrace, carrying within her the new life that would bind them together forever, and had understood with absolute clarity that her life had not been diminished by accepting this marriage. It had been exponentially expanded. January arrived with unusual severity. The snow that had begun on Christmas night continued through the first weeks of the new year, creating conditions that made travel treacherous and isolated Meridian Hall in a way that Sophie found oddly comforting. The estate became a world unto itself, with the household operating in a kind of insulated rhythm that made the outside world seem almost irrelevant. It was during this period of isolation that Viscount Edward Hartwell announced his intention to visit. The news came via letter, delivered by a courier who had somehow navigated the snow-covered roads to reach the estate. The letter was addressed to the Duke, but Elizabeth brought it to Sophie first, her expression conveying something between concern and irritation. "My nephew has decided to honor us with his presence," she said, handing the letter to Sophie with the kind of gesture that suggested she was passing along something vaguely contaminated. "He writes that he wishes to become better acquainted with his new aunt, and that he hopes to spend several weeks at Meridian Hall during the winter season." Sophie took the letter and read it herself. Edward's handwriting was elegant and precise, his words carefully calibrated to suggest warmth and family feeling. Yet something in the phrasing created a sense of unease, a quality that was almost predatory beneath the veneer of courtesy. "Does he often visit?" Sophie asked. "Rarely," Elizabeth replied. "He prefers London society to the country. His sudden interest in extended visits to Meridian Hall is, I suspect, motivated by something other than familial affection." The Duke, when informed of Edward's impending arrival, exhibited none of the concern that Elizabeth had suggested. Instead, he seemed almost amused by his nephew's letter. "Edward has always been something of a schemer," he said to Sophie as they sat together in the library one afternoon. "He is not inherently malicious, but he is ambitious in a way that is sometimes untempered by wisdom. He believed, when he was younger, that he would inherit Meridian Hall and its attendant wealth. When it became clear that I intended to marry and produce my own heir, he was somewhat disappointed. He has spent the intervening years attempting to position himself as my most valued relative, hoping perhaps that if no heir were forthcoming, I would recognize his claims favorably." "And now?" Sophie asked. "Now that there will be an heir?" "Now," the Duke said, "he must adjust his calculations, but he is not a man to accept such adjustments gracefully. I suspect his visit is motivated by curiosity regarding you, and perhaps by some vague hope that he might find ammunition to use against our marriage, should the opportunity present itself." "And do you fear that such ammunition exists?" Sophie asked carefully. The Duke reached over and took her hand, a gesture that had become habitual between them. "I fear nothing regarding our marriage," he said with absolute certainty. "Our union is built on genuine partnership and mutual regard." Edward's opinions matter very little in the face of that reality, but Sophie found herself experiencing anxiety despite the Duke's reassurance. She had lived for 22 years in a world where appearance and propriety were paramount, where the perception of impropriety could be as devastating as actual impropriety, where the suggestions of those with social power could unmake a woman's reputation with casual malice. And though her position as Duchess was now secure in many respects, she remained aware that there were still people in the world who might view her with skepticism, who might question whether a woman married so precipitously to a man so significantly older than herself could have truly done so from affection rather than calculation. Edward arrived on a day of particular cold, the kind of winter day when the sky was white rather than blue, when the air itself seemed to have weight and texture. His carriage drew up to the entrance of Meridian Hall with theatrical precision, and he emerged dressed in the height of London fashion, a sharp contrast to the practical garments that the Duke and other country gentlemen wore. He was extraordinarily handsome. Sophie registered this immediately and with a kind of defensive awareness. He possessed the kind of beauty that was almost aggressive in its perfection. Pale blonde hair arranged with meticulous precision, features that seemed almost sculpted, eyes of a cold grey blue that contained no warmth. He was the kind of man that society women would notice, would discuss, would find captivating. And he was also, Sophie sensed immediately, dangerous in a way that was difficult to articulate. "My dear uncle," Edward said, embracing the Duke with a familiarity that seemed calculated to establish intimacy, "and my aunt." He turned to Sophie with a smile that did not reach his eyes. "What a remarkable development your marriage has been. London society is quite fascinated by the circumstances of your union. They do so love a dramatic narrative. I trust London society finds sufficient entertainment without requiring us to provide it," the Duke replied evenly. "You are welcome at Meridian Hall, as you are always welcome. However, I should inform you that my household operates according to certain principles. One of those principles is that my wife is treated with the utmost respect and consideration. Is that understood?" Edward's smile did not waver, but Sophie saw something shift in his eyes, a recognition that the Duke had identified his intentions before any particular action had been taken. "Of course, uncle," Edward said smoothly. "I should expect nothing less than that you would defend your wife's honor. One of your admirable qualities, after all, is your somewhat antiquated sense of chivalry." The implication was clear, that the Duke's protectiveness of Sophie was not strength, but rather a kind of outdated foolishness. And Sophie found herself bristling at the suggestion, not because she believed it, but because she recognized it as a calculated attempt to sow discord. Over the following days, Edward's presence at Meridian Hall became a kind of constant discomfort. He was not overtly disrespectful, but he was consistently undermining. He would make casual remarks about the Duke's age, suggesting that he must be finding the demands of active estate management increasingly taxing. He would comment on Sophie's appearance, always with sufficient courtesy to avoid direct insult, but with sufficient subtext to suggest that her beauty was either artificial or unexceptional. He would ask pointed questions about her family background, her education, her previous experience, all phrased in a manner that suggested he was attempting to understand how such a woman had managed to secure a position so substantially elevated above her origins. What Edward did not understand, or perhaps did not wish to acknowledge, was that Sophie was no longer the woman she had been 6 months previous. She had been forged through the honest regard of the Duke and through her own growing recognition of her own value into someone who could not be undermined by the casual malice of a beautiful but fundamentally empty young man. "Your nephew grows tedious," she said to the Duke one night after Edward had retired to his chambers. "I suspect his visit is motivated by something more specific than mere curiosity." "I suspect you are correct," the Duke replied, "but his motivations are of minimal concern to me. What concerns me is whether his presence is causing you distress. If so, I will ask him to depart immediately." "No," Sophie said, surprising herself with her own certainty. "Let him remain. Let him observe that our marriage is genuine, that our partnership is real. Let him come to understand that whatever calculations he has been making regarding our union are based on fundamental misunderstandings of who we are and what we have created together." The Duke looked at her with an expression of profound admiration. "You are remarkable," he said simply. "Do you understand that? You have become a woman of genuine strength and clarity. Edward will leave this estate understanding that he has encountered something far beyond his comprehension." Edward's presence at Meridian Hall extended through late January and into February, and with each passing week, Sophie found her initial anxiety transforming into something more akin to curiosity. She began to recognize that Edward's undermining remarks, while clearly intentional, were also somewhat desperate. He seemed to be testing the strength of her marriage with increasing intensity, looking for fractures that simply did not exist. What became clear to Sophie, as she observed her husband and her brother-in-law together, was that the Duke had long since ceased to be the source of Edward's genuine affection or filial regard. Edward was performing respect, performing familial warmth, in the way that a skilled actor might perform any role. And the Duke, for his part, was aware of this performance and seemed to find it more sad than concerning. It was during a dinner party that the Duke had arranged, inviting the neighboring families of significance to meet Sophie formally as Duchess, that Edward made his critical miscalculation. The evening had progressed smoothly, and Sophie had felt genuinely confident in her role. She had managed the conversation, directed the courses, created an atmosphere that was simultaneously formal and warm. She was wearing a gown of rich sapphire silk that the Duke had commissioned for her, and she had felt beautiful in a way that was not dependent on anyone's external validation. Toward the end of the evening, as the ladies had withdrawn to the drawing-room, while the gentlemen enjoyed port and cigars, the wife of the neighboring baronet had made a casual observation regarding Sophie's apparent pregnancy. "You must be delighted, Your Grace," Lady Ashworth had said, "to be expecting so quickly. It demonstrates the Duke's continued vitality, which some might have questioned given his age." The remark was innocuous enough on its surface, but it contained the kind of subtle poison that suggested the Duke's age was something that required compensation through proof of his physical capability. Before Sophie could formulate a response, Edward's voice had come from the doorway. He had apparently followed the ladies, an impropriety that should have prevented him from speaking, but which had not. "One might indeed wonder," Edward had said, his tone suggesting he was making a light jest, "whether the pregnancy is authentic evidence of my uncle's capacity, or whether it is merely evidence of his wife's eagerness to secure her position through the presentation of an heir. The speed of the conception is, after all, somewhat remarkable, given that they had been strangers mere months previous." The silence that followed his words was absolute and devastating. Every woman in the room understood exactly what Edward had suggested, that Sophie might have deliberately conceived to trap the Duke into deeper commitment, or worse, that the child might not be the Duke's at all. It was a whisper of scandal, delivered with sufficient plausible deniability that it could be repeated throughout society as inference rather than direct accusation. Sophie felt the blood drain from her face. She felt her hands begin to tremble. She felt, for the first time since accepting the Duke's proposal, the return of the old Sophie, the woman who was uncertain, who was vulnerable, who could be unmade by the casual cruelty of society. But then the Duke appeared in the doorway, his expression a mask of controlled fury that was somehow more devastating than rage would have been. "Edward," he said, his voice carrying an edge that would have cut through steel, "you have crossed a line from which there is no return. You are no longer welcome at Meridian Hall. You will depart tomorrow morning. You will not return. And you will not speak of my wife, this pregnancy, or this marriage to anyone. If I hear even a whisper of the suggestions you have made this evening, I will ensure that your reputation is destroyed so completely that you will find yourself unable to secure a position even in the furthest reaches of society. Do you understand me?" Edward's face had gone pale. He had clearly believed that his position as the Duke's nephew would protect him from serious consequences. He had apparently not fully understood that there were lines that, once crossed, could not be uncrossed. "Uncle, I was merely making conversation, a slight jest," Edward had begun. "You were suggesting with calculated malice that my wife is either unfaithful or deliberately deceived me into fatherhood." The Duke had interrupted coldly. "That is not a jest. That is a direct assault on the honor of my wife and the legitimacy of my child. You will leave at dawn." The Duke had then turned to Lady Ashworth and the other assembled guests, his expression transforming into something more controlled, but no less commanding. "I trust you will understand that my nephew has become temporarily unwell. His departure is necessary for the health of everyone in this household. I hope you will pardon the disruption to this evening." After the guests had departed, and Edward had been escorted to his chamber under the watchful eye of the Duke's most senior servants, the Duke had come to find Sophie in the conservatory, where she had retreated to attempt to regain her composure. She had been trembling when he found her, the old vulnerability threatening to overwhelm the confidence she had so carefully constructed. "He is gone," the Duke had said simply, drawing her close, "and he will not return. More importantly, no one in this county will listen to his suggestions. Do you understand why?" "Because they respect you," Sophie had whispered. "Because," the Duke had corrected gently, "they respect us. because every person in this county has observed our genuine partnership, because they have seen that you are a woman of intelligence and dignity, because they understand that a union such as ours, a union that transcends age and circumstance, speaks to something far deeper than mere calculation or deception. Edward's suggestions fall against the reality of what we have created together, and they shatter like glass. He had held her through the night, and Sophie had understood something fundamental. She was no longer the woman who could be unmade by society's judgment. She had been remade, through the choices she had made, and through the genuine regard of the man who loved her, into someone whose worth was not dependent on anyone's external validation. Edward had departed the following morning, and Meridian Hall had settled back into its rhythm of genuine peace. But something had shifted. The threat, once it had been made and then decisively addressed, had paradoxically strengthened the bond between Sophie and the Duke. They had been tested, and they had emerged stronger for the testing. As February progressed into March, spring began to announce its arrival with increasing confidence. The snow melted, revealing the garden structures that had been hidden beneath layers of white. The trees, which had been skeletal and bare, began to show the faintest hints of green, and Sophie's pregnancy, which had still seemed almost theoretical in the winter months, became increasingly real and increasingly evident. Her body was changing in ways that were simultaneously miraculous and challenging. The child within her was growing with visible speed, and Sophie found herself moving through the world with a new kind of awareness of her own physicality. She was not merely a person occupying space, she was the vehicle through which new life was being created. The Duke's attentiveness during this period was extraordinary. He insisted on accompanying her on her walks around the estate, ensuring that she did not overextend herself. He arranged for additional pillows and support in their shared bed, aware of the discomfort that her expanding belly was causing. He engaged a specialist midwife from London to ensure that the pregnancy was progressing normally, and he spent considerable time in conversation with the woman, asking detailed questions about what Sophie might expect, how he might best support her, what signs might suggest complications that required immediate medical attention. What struck Sophie most profoundly was that he seemed to take genuine interest in the pregnancy, not merely as the means through which he would acquire an heir, but as a remarkable phenomenon in itself. He would place his hand on her belly, feeling the child move, and his expression would transform into something that combined wonder with an almost vulnerable tenderness. "Can you feel her?" he asked one afternoon, as they sat together in the conservatory. "Her?" Sophie queried. "Are you certain it is a daughter?" "I have no certainty," the Duke replied, "but I find myself hoping for a daughter, a child with your qualities, your intelligence, your capacity for genuine feeling. That would be a remarkable gift to give to the world." Sophie had experienced a complicated reaction to this sentiment. Part of her, the part that still retained some of the old conditioning regarding women's secondary status, had expected that the Duke would desire a son, someone to carry forward the family name and assume the title. Yet his expressed hope for a daughter revealed something fundamental about the evolution of his thinking. He no longer viewed a child merely as a means through which his legacy would be perpetuated. He viewed a child as a person, a full human being worthy of existence for their own sake, regardless of gender. "I think I should like a daughter," Sophie had said quietly, "though I confess I have no idea how to be a mother. I was largely raised by servants, and my own mother has been so consumed with financial worries that our relationship was never particularly nurturing." "You will be an extraordinary mother," the Duke had said with absolute certainty, "because you have learned, through the experiences of your own life, what it means to be overlooked and undervalued. And because of this knowledge, you will ensure that our daughter knows her own worth from the earliest moment of her existence." In early April, as Sophie's pregnancy entered its final month, the household began the elaborate preparations for the arrival of the child. A nursery was prepared with meticulous attention to detail. The furniture was arranged to provide maximum comfort and accessibility. The walls were painted a soft sage green that suggested growth and renewal, and the windows were positioned to provide light without excessive heat from the summer sun. Lady Elizabeth, who had by this point become something approaching a genuine friend to Sophie, oversaw much of the preparation. She brought with her the cradle that her brother had slept in as an infant, a beautiful piece of mahogany, intricately carved with scenes of nature and growth. "This cradle has held 3 generations of thorns," Elizabeth said, running her hand along the carved surface. "It held Richard, and it held his first son with Eleanor, though that child lived only 3 days. It is appropriate that it should be prepared for the child who will, God willing, grow to full maturity and carry forward the family legacy. Sophie had not known about the Duke's first child, a son who had been born and died within days of birth. She had understood from her conversations with the Duke that Eleanor had borne him no children, and he had never corrected this misunderstanding. It was not until later, when she asked him about this revelation, that he had explained. Eleanor did become pregnant, he had said quietly. She carried the child to term, but he was born too early and was not sufficiently developed to survive outside the womb. Eleanor blamed herself profoundly. She believed that some action of her own had caused the premature birth. In truth, the physicians could offer no explanation, but Eleanor never fully recovered from the loss. She became convinced that she was fundamentally flawed, that she could not fulfill the primary duty of a wife, which was the production of an heir. The knowledge that she could not give me children became the defining tragedy of her life. Sophie had experienced profound sadness for this first Eleanor, a woman she had never met but whose grief had shadowed the entire arc of her marriage, and she had understood with new clarity the extraordinary nature of the Duke's trust in her, his willingness to permit her to carry his child despite having experienced loss through this same vulnerability. "I will be careful," she had promised him. "I will protect this child with everything I possess." "I know you will," he had replied. "That is precisely why I am confident in the future." As April gave way to May, Sophie found herself experiencing a strange kind of peace. The anxiety that had characterized the early months of her pregnancy had given way to a kind of acceptance. The child within her was becoming increasingly real. She could feel distinct movements, moments of what seemed almost like personality expressing itself through physicality. She found herself speaking to the child, explaining who she was, what the world would be like, how loved she or he already was. The Duke sometimes caught her in these one-sided conversations and would smile with the kind of warmth that suggested he understood entirely what she was doing. She was building the foundation of a relationship that would extend throughout the child's life, beginning long before actual birth. On the evening of May 15th, as Sophie prepared for bed and the Duke was reviewing estate documents in the library, she felt something shift dramatically. It was not precisely pain, but rather an intensity of sensation that suggested significant change. She called for the Duke with increasing urgency, and within moments he was at her side, his expression transforming into something that combined concern with recognition. "The child is coming," he said simply. "Send for Dr. Ashworth, send for the midwife, and Sophie, I will be here. Whatever happens, you will not face this alone." The labor began at nightfall and continued through the darkness with the kind of intensity that Sophie had not anticipated, despite all the preparation and instruction. The pain was profound and primal, unlike anything she had experienced. It was as though her body had been taken over by a force far greater than her conscious will, a force that was determined to expel the child she had been carrying for 9 months. The Duke remained at her side through the night, not merely present but actively engaged. He held her hand during the strongest contractions. He spoke to her in a voice that combined strength with extraordinary tenderness. He refused to permit her to believe that she could not endure what she was enduring, even as she reached moments of genuine despair when she believed that survival itself was becoming unlikely. "You are the strongest woman I have ever known," he told her repeatedly, his voice never wavering despite the obvious distress her suffering was causing him. "You are creating life. You are bringing forth a new person into the world. This is the most courageous act a human being can undertake, and you are undertaking it with grace and strength." Dr. Ashworth was present, a calm, steady presence, who examined her periodically and offered quiet encouragement. The midwife, Mrs. Coleman, was a woman of perhaps 60, whose weathered face suggested she had presided over hundreds of births. She guided Sophie through each contraction, instructing her when to push, when to breathe, how to work with her body rather than against it. As dawn broke, the intensity of the labor increased. Sophie found herself in a kind of delirium born from exhaustion and pain, though she retained enough consciousness to be aware of the Duke's hand in hers, his voice anchoring her to something beyond the immediate physical agony. "The head is visible," Mrs. Coleman announced. "One more strong push, Your Grace. The child is nearly here." Sophie gathered what seemed like the final reserves of strength remaining in her body and pushed with an intensity that felt as though it might tear her apart. And then suddenly, the weight within her was gone. There was a moment of profound relief immediately followed by the sound of a child crying. a sound so loud and indignant and absolutely alive that Sophie felt tears streaming down her face. "A daughter," Mrs. Coleman said, her voice carrying unmistakable pleasure. "A beautiful, healthy daughter." The child was placed on Sophie's chest, wet and bloody and perfect, and Sophie found herself looking into the eyes of her daughter for the first time. The baby had dark hair, and as her eyes opened, Sophie saw that they were a pale blue that would likely darken with time. She was small and perfect, and utterly miraculous. "Eleanor," the Duke said softly, speaking not to Sophie, but to his daughter. "Welcome to the world, Eleanor. I am your father, and I have been waiting for you." Sophie looked at her husband and understood in that moment the full extent of his capacity for love. This man had loved another woman for 30 years. He had experienced profound loss through the death of that woman. He had loved another child born to him briefly, and lost just as quickly. And now he was opening his heart yet again to the possibility of loving this new life with complete vulnerability. The next days existed in a kind of haze for Sophie. Her body was sore in ways that suggested she might never move comfortably again, though the pain gradually diminished as time passed. She slept in fragmented intervals, awakening when Eleanor required feeding or changing, attempting to understand the mysterious logic that governed newborn behavior. The Duke was present throughout this period. He handled Elena with surprising confidence, cradling her in his large hands with an attentiveness that suggested he had done this before, which he had not. He cleaned the nursery, managed the household staff, ensured that Sophie had everything she required to recover. And most importantly, he looked at both of them, his wife and his daughter, with an expression that contained such profound love that Sophie sometimes found herself overwhelmed by the recognition of how thoroughly her life had been transformed. Elizabeth came to see the new arrival and wept openly at the sight of her niece. "She is perfect," she said, holding Eleanor with surprising gentleness. "And Richard finally has what he has been seeking, not merely an heir but a child born from genuine love and partnership." On the 4th day after Eleanor's birth, Sophie found herself alone with the Duke in the morning light. Eleanor was sleeping in her cradle, and for a moment there was silence, genuine silence rather than the fragmented quiet of the previous days. "Thank you," the Duke said simply. "For what?" Sophie asked, though she understood his meaning. "For everything," he replied. "For accepting a marriage born of necessity, for permitting me to know you, for building genuine partnership with me, for carrying my daughter, for becoming the woman that you have become, for teaching me that love is not a finite resource, that it is instead infinitely expansible, that a man can love multiple times in his life in progressively deeper and more meaningful ways. Thank you for that education." Sophie reached out and took his hand. She thought about the woman she had been 5 months ago, desperate, resigned, believing that her life was essentially over. She thought about the journey that had brought her to this moment, this man, this child, this life that was so profoundly different from anything she could have anticipated. "I was given to you," she said softly, "because my family needed security, but in being given to you, I discovered that I was being given myself. You taught me that I was worth something, that my thoughts and feelings and existence mattered. You gave me back my life, just in a different form than I had expected. Thank you for that." Outside, spring continued its relentless progress. The gardens of Meridian Hall were bursting with new growth, and inside, in a great house that was no longer merely a residence but a genuine home, a family, built from necessity but sustained by authentic love, watched over a new life and understood that transformation was not merely possible but inevitable when two people chose to build something real together. The weeks immediately following Eleanor's birth were characterized by a fragility that Sophie had not anticipated. Her body, though no longer carrying the child, seemed to have become something unrecognizable, something that functioned only sporadically and according to its own mysterious logic. She experienced bleeding that continued far longer than she expected, exhaustion that seemed to have become a permanent state, and a kind of emotional volatility that embarrassed her even as she experienced it. Dr. Ashworth visited twice weekly to ensure that her recovery was progressing appropriately. He was reassuring regarding most aspects of her condition. The bleeding was normal. The fatigue was expected given the intensity of the labor. The emotional shifts were entirely consistent with what women experience during the postpartum period. But he also issued firm instructions regarding activity. She was to rest extensively, to permit the household staff to manage the physical demands of the estate, to focus entirely on her recovery and the care of Eleanor. The Duke seemed to interpret these instructions with particular seriousness. He reduced his own activity regarding the estate management, delegating significant responsibilities to the steward so that he could remain at Meridian Hall during this critical period. He spent considerable time with Eleanor in the nursery, learning the rhythms of infant care, understanding the different varieties of crying that the child employed to communicate her various needs. What struck Sophie most profoundly was his willingness to be present for the unglamorous aspects of motherhood. When Eleanor developed the rash that occasionally afflicted infants, it was the Duke who carefully applied the recommended salve. When she cried through the night with digestive discomfort, it was the Duke who paced the nursery with her, while Sophie attempted to recover some semblance of strength. When Eleanor exhibited the peculiar jerking movements that sometimes alarmed new mothers, it was the Duke who consulted with Dr. Ashworth and then reported back with the information that these movements were entirely normal and indicated no cause for concern. "She is extraordinary," he said to Sophie one afternoon in early June, as she sat in the drawing room attempting to recover sufficient energy to participate in the business of her household. Eleanor was sleeping in her cradle beside Sophie's chair, and the Duke was watching both mother and daughter with an expression of profound tenderness. "Look at her fingers, so minute, yet so perfectly formed, and her face. When she is sleeping, she has an expression that suggests she is contemplating the mysteries of the universe." "She is a baby," Sophie replied gently, though she was smiling at his romantic assessment. "She is likely contemplating nothing more complex than feeding schedules and dry linens." "Perhaps," the Duke conceded, "but I prefer to imagine that she is contemplating profound truths. It seems more appropriate to her dignity." It was during this recovery period that Sophie experienced something unexpected, a moment of profound doubt regarding the trajectory of her life. It occurred during a particularly difficult night when Eleanor was crying inconsolably, and Sophie's body was aching with the accumulated exhaustion of weeks of fragmented sleep. She was sitting in the nursery at 3 o'clock in the morning, holding her daughter, and feeling a despair that seemed to have no proportional cause. She had everything she had believed she wanted. She was secure, she was valued, she was a mother to a beautiful child, she had a husband who loved her. Yet in this moment, she felt utterly overwhelmed by the weight of responsibility, by the knowledge that this tiny person was entirely dependent on her survival and well-being, by the awareness that she was no longer simply Sophie, but was now defined entirely by her roles: Duchess, wife, mother. The Duke found her there, tears streaming down her face, while Eleanor wailed, and Sophie felt herself breaking beneath the accumulated pressure. He took Eleanor from her without speaking, and he moved to the window where the pre-dawn darkness was just beginning to yield to hints of approaching dawn. He spoke to his daughter in low, soothing tones, not the words themselves seeming to matter, but rather the calm, steady rhythm of his voice creating a kind of anchor in the chaos. Gradually, Eleanor's crying diminished. Her tiny body relaxed against the Duke's chest, and her eyes, which had been screwed shut in infant fury, opened and seemed to focus on the face above her. Only then did the Duke turn to Sophie. "What you are experiencing," he said quietly, "is not weakness or failure. It is the weight of transformation that comes from understanding suddenly and completely that another human being is entirely dependent on your choices, your energy, your capacity to survive. This is the deepest kind of responsibility, and it is entirely appropriate to feel overwhelmed by it." He moved to sit beside Sophie, Eleanor now resting peacefully against his shoulder. "However, you need not bear this responsibility alone. That is the purpose of partnership, Sophie. You do not have to do this by yourself. You have me, you have Elizabeth, you have the household staff, you have an entire network of support. I need you to understand that asking for help is not a failure. It is wisdom." Sophie had wept then, not the tears of despair, but rather tears of release. She had been so focused on being strong, on proving her capability as a mother and a duchess, that she had forgotten to permit herself to be vulnerable in the way that all new mothers were vulnerable. In the days following this night, something shifted in the household dynamics. Sophie permitted herself to rest more completely. She relinquished some of the household management to Elizabeth, trusting her sister-in-law's competence and recognizing that this was not a diminishment of her authority, but rather a pragmatic allocation of responsibility. She spent more time with Eleanor, simply observing her daughter, learning her temperament, recognizing the specific cries and expressions that communicated her various needs, and gradually Her body began to recover. The bleeding ceased. The exhaustion, while not disappearing entirely, became manageable rather than overwhelming. Her emotional state stabilized, though she found herself experiencing a kind of hyper-awareness regarding Eleanor's well-being that Dr. Ashworth assured her was entirely normal and would gradually diminish as her confidence in her capability as a mother increased. By mid-June, Sophie found herself capable of resuming some of her household responsibilities. But she did so differently than she might have expected. Instead of returning to the kind of driven perfectionism that had characterized her early months as Duchess, she approached her duties with a kind of intentional purposefulness. She completed what required completion, but she did not pursue unnecessary expansion of her responsibilities. She delegated where appropriate. She permitted imperfection in areas where imperfection was irrelevant to actual function. The Duke observed this shift with evident satisfaction. "You are becoming not merely a capable Duchess," he said to her one afternoon, as they walked together in the gardens, while Eleanor slept in a carefully positioned pram, being watched over by her nurse, "but a wise Duchess. You have learned the critical distinction between doing what is required and doing what is unnecessary. That is perhaps the most valuable knowledge a woman in your position can acquire." "I have learned it through near collapse," Sophie replied with characteristic honesty. "I would prefer to have learned it through less dramatic means." "Nevertheless," the Duke said, taking her hand, "you have learned it. And you have learned, additionally, that your worth is not dependent on constant activity or perfect performance. Your worth is inherent. Your value exists regardless of what you accomplish. That is perhaps the most important lesson of all." As June progressed into July, and Eleanor began to demonstrate the earliest signs of personality beyond the generic attributes of infancy, Sophie found herself experiencing something that could only be described as joy. The fragility that had characterized the immediate postpartum period had been replaced by a kind of grounded confidence. She was becoming increasingly capable in her role as a mother. She was finding her rhythm as a Duchess. And most significantly, she was rediscovering herself as a woman, not the desperate young woman who had accepted the Duke's proposal, not the anxious bride who had entered her marriage uncertain and afraid, but a woman who had been tested by circumstance and who had emerged stronger, more confident, and infinitely more capable of genuinely appreciating the extraordinary gift of her life. Eleanor's development over the summer months was remarkable, not merely in the physical sense of growth and increasing capability, though those were evident, but in the emergence of personality that seemed to suggest that this small person was far more than merely a collection of biological functions. By late July, Eleanor was tracking movement with her eyes, responding to familiar voices with what appeared to be recognition, and beginning to smile in a manner that suggested genuine pleasure rather than mere digestive reflex. It was the Duke who first suggested that Eleanor bore a remarkable resemblance to Sophie's mother. "Look at the set of her mouth," he said, holding Eleanor up to the light filtering through the windows of the nursery. "And the expression in her eyes when she is considering something with intensity. That is entirely your mother's countenance." Sophie observed her daughter with renewed attention and recognized the accuracy of his observation. Eleanor had dark hair that appeared to be darkening further, moving from the midnight black of newborns towards something more akin to deep brown. Her eyes, though still that pale blue that would likely not stabilize into permanent color for months, had a particular intensity when focused on an object of interest. And there was something in the set of her features that did indeed suggest Margaret Ashford. Sophie's mother had arrived at Meridian Hall in early July, ostensibly to ensure that Sophie was recovering appropriately, but in reality, Sophie suspected, to escape the cramped quarters in London, where she had been living since her financial situation had stabilized through Sophie's marriage. Margaret had wept upon first seeing Eleanor, not the complicated tears of her response to Sophie's marriage, but genuine tears of joy and gratitude. "She is perfect," Margaret had whispered, holding her granddaughter with a tenderness that Sophie rarely observed in her mother's interactions. "Absolutely perfect. Your father would have been so pleased to know her." The relationship between Margaret and Eleanor seemed to fill a void that Sophie had not fully recognized existed. Her mother, who had spent years focused on securing Sophie's future, now had space to focus on something different, the development and well-being of her grandchild. She spent hours in the nursery, teaching Eleanor the lullabies that had been sung to Sophie, telling stories of family history, sharing a kind of maternal energy that suggested this was, in many ways, a second opportunity for Margaret to experience motherhood from a perspective of relative security and peace. Elizabeth, meanwhile, had taken on the role of mentor regarding the more formal aspects of Eleanor's upbringing. She had engaged a music master to begin training Eleanor from infancy, a modern approach based on the theory that exposure to music and rhythm from the earliest possible moment would develop the child's natural musical inclinations. She had also commissioned a series of portraits capturing Eleanor at different stages of her development, creating a visual record of her transformation that would ostensibly be valuable to Eleanor herself in her maturity. What Sophie observed with some amusement was that both her mother and her sister-in-law seemed to be attempting to shape Eleanor in different directions. Margaret was focused on transmitting family history and emotional connection. Elizabeth was focused on developing accomplishment and refined capability. The Duke, observing these competing visions for his daughter's future, seemed to find genuine enjoyment in the complexity. Eleanor will become whatever combination of all of these influences creates her own authentic character, he said to Sophie one evening as they sat together in the library while Eleanor slept in her cradle nearby. We are simply providing the raw materials. What she constructs from them will be entirely her own creation. It was during this conversation that the Duke broached a subject that Sophie had not fully considered, the question of future children. I would not wish you to face another pregnancy immediately, he began carefully. Your body requires time to fully recover from Eleanor's birth. However, I find myself hoping that Eleanor might eventually have siblings. I wonder whether you share this wish, or whether the experience of pregnancy and childbirth has discouraged you from repeating it. Sophie considered the question with genuine attention. A year ago, the idea of deliberate pregnancy would have seemed impossible, something that happened to women rather than something women actively chose. But her experience of carrying Eleanor, despite its challenges, had not been entirely negative, and the reward of motherhood, the extraordinary connection between herself and her daughter, made the prospect of experiencing it again seem less daunting than she might have anticipated. I would like to give you more children, she said finally. Though I confess I hope they are daughters, I find the prospect of raising sons more intimidating than I would like to admit. The Duke had laughed at this confession. Eleanor will require brothers to teach her how men think, how they operate in the world, but I suspect that Eleanor, once she is old enough to assert herself, will have little difficulty teaching them lessons in return. She seems to have inherited your capacity for intelligent assessment of others. As August progressed, Sophie found herself gradually resuming fuller engagement with the household and estate management. She attended to correspondence, participated in the small social occasions that were appropriate for a woman in her position, and began to think more strategically about the future development of Meridian Hall. The Duke's steward had suggested several improvements to the gardens that would require significant investment. The eastern wing of the house, which had fallen into mild disrepair, required attention, and there were opportunities for improvement in the agricultural operations that supported the estate's financial health. For the first time since becoming Duchess, Sophie found herself thinking in terms of years and decades, rather than merely managing each day as it arrived. She was building something, not merely maintaining what had been built by previous generations, but actually creating something new that would outlast her own lifetime. Eleanor would inherit this estate. Eleanor would govern it. Eleanor would, if she chose to marry and remain in England, raise her own children here. The thought was simultaneously humbling and empowering. Sophie was no longer merely a woman who had been given to a man in marriage. She was becoming the foundational matriarch of a family line that would extend forward into the future. In late August, as the summer heat began to yield to the first intimations of autumn, the Duke invited the neighboring families to an informal gathering celebrating Eleanor's christening. The event had technically occurred in June, shortly after Sophie's recovery was deemed sufficient for her to leave the nursery, but the Duke had wanted to host a more substantial celebration that would formally present Eleanor to society and establish her position as the legitimate heir to Meridian Hall. Sophie found herself anxious about this event in a way that surprised her. She had been nervous during the dinner party where Edward had made his vicious suggestions, but she had moved through that anxiety with the kind of courage that comes from understanding that one has nothing to lose. Now, she had everything to lose. Her position as Duchess was secure, her relationship with the Duke was genuine, and the last thing she desired was for any suggestion of impropriety to taint Eleanor's entry into society. She spent considerable time with Elizabeth discussing the arrangements, ensuring that every element was precisely calibrated to communicate the legitimacy and solidity of the marriage. The christening gown was the same one that had been worn by generations of Thorne children. The visual statement of Eleanor's integration into the family line would be unmistakable. The day of the gathering arrived with perfect summer weather, not the oppressive heat of earlier in the season, but a warm, clear afternoon that suggested the blessing of benevolent natural forces. Sophie stood in the drawing room with Eleanor in her arms, dressed in the christening gown that had been carefully preserved and maintained, and felt the Duke's hand at her waist in a gesture of quiet support. "You are an extraordinary mother," he said quietly, so that only she could hear. "Eleanor is fortunate beyond measure to have you, and I am fortunate beyond measure to have you both." When the gathering began and neighbors began arriving to offer congratulations and admire Eleanor, Sophie found that her anxiety had largely dissipated. She was no longer attempting to prove anything to society. She was simply presenting her daughter, her healthy, thriving, extraordinary daughter, to the world, and the world's response was appropriately admiring. By the end of the afternoon, as the final guests were departing, Sophie found herself exhausted but deeply satisfied. Eleanor had slept through much of the gathering, and several visitors had commented on how well-behaved the child was, how evidently she was thriving, how clear it was that she was loved and properly cared for. "You have done it," Elizabeth said quietly to Sophie as they were clearing the drawing room. "You have completely established yourself. There is not a person in this county who has any doubt regarding your position or Eleanor's legitimacy. You have succeeded completely in what you set out to accomplish." "What I set out to accomplish," Sophie replied, "was merely to survive the marriage I was offered. Everything beyond that has been unexpected gift." Autumn arrived with spectacular color, the trees surrounding Meridian Hall transforming into shades of gold and crimson that seemed almost impossibly vibrant. Eleanor was now 4 months old, and her personality had begun to assert itself with increasing clarity. She was a child who seemed to observe the world with intense concentration, who smiled readily but not indiscriminately, who possessed what could only be described as a sense of humor, laughing at unexpected sounds and at the various games that the adults around her devised to amuse her. The Duke's sister had returned to her own residence in early September, but she did so with clear affection for both Sophie and Eleanor. More significantly, she had ceased to regard Sophie as an outsider or potential threat to the family legacy. Instead, she had become something approaching a genuine mentor, sharing the accumulated knowledge of decades of managing great households, offering counsel regarding the complex social dynamics that governed the world of the aristocracy, and providing the kind of wise female companionship that Sophie's mother, though loving, was perhaps too emotionally invested to offer. "You should begin attending London functions," Elizabeth had suggested during one of her final afternoons at Meridian Hall. "Your position is now so secure that you can move through society with complete confidence, and Eleanor will require, as she grows, exposure to the broader world beyond these estates. You should begin establishing the kinds of connections that will eventually be valuable to her." Sophie had been initially resistant to the idea of returning to London. Her memories of the city were complicated. She remembered the desperation of her family's financial collapse, the shame of observing her mother's humiliation, the weight of knowing that they were slowly descending into obscurity. London was the place where she had learned how quickly fortune could be lost, how quickly a family could become invisible to society. But the Duke had taken up Elizabeth's suggestion with enthusiasm. "I have spent the last 5 years largely removed from society," he said to Sophie. "I permitted grief to isolate me in ways that were perhaps excessive. I believe now that both you and Eleanor would benefit from experiencing the broader world. And I confess that I would appreciate the opportunity to demonstrate to London society that I have not merely recovered from Eleanor's death, but have built something new, something that honors her memory, while acknowledging that I am capable of love and partnership beyond that single significant relationship." In late October, they had traveled to London, taking with them not only Eleanor and her nurse, but also Sophie's mother and a substantial portion of the household staff. The Duke's London residence had been opened and aired, cleaned and provisioned, and Sophie found herself preparing to enter into society not as a desperate young woman seeking any escape from poverty, but as the Duchess of Meridian, a woman of position, a woman who was secure, a woman who carried herself with the kind of quiet confidence that comes from knowing one is genuinely valued. The transformation was remarkable. In her new gowns, designed by the most exclusive modiste in London, Sophie moved through society with an assurance that would have been unimaginable to her a year previous. She was no longer the kind of woman who attempted to make herself invisible. She was no longer apologizing for her presence or her opinions. What surprised her most was that society seemed to have entirely rewritten the narrative of her marriage. Rather than viewing it as a desperate union between an aging man and a young woman seeking security, it was now perceived as a remarkable match, a union that somehow worked despite the obvious impediments that might have prevented it from functioning. The fact that Sophie had become pregnant so quickly, that she had produced a healthy daughter, that she appeared genuinely devoted to the Duke, that the Duke appeared genuinely devoted to her, all of this served to transform the marriage in society's collective understanding. They attended the opera, where Sophie observed the performance with genuine interest while being acutely aware of the observations that other attendees were making regarding her appearance and demeanor. They attended various social gatherings, where Sophie's intelligence and refined manners created a positive impression, and most significantly, they permitted selected members of society to meet Eleanor, who by now was displaying personality enough that observers could not help but be charmed by her. One afternoon in November, during a particularly exclusive gathering of the wives of the most prominent families in London, Sophie found herself in conversation with the Countess of Wellingford, a woman of perhaps 60 who had known the Duke's first wife and who had apparently harbored some skepticism regarding the wisdom of his second marriage. "I confess," the Countess said, her tone suggesting that such confession came difficult to her, "that when I first heard of your marriage, I believed the Duke had made a grievous error. I knew Eleanor, his first wife, quite well. We were presented to society in the same season. She was a remarkable woman, gracious, intelligent, capable of managing the most complex households and social situations. I could not imagine how any woman could follow her without being found wanting." Sophie listened carefully, understanding that this was not a compliment but rather an assessment that she was being found wanting. The Countess continued, "However, I have observed you over the past weeks, and I find that I was incorrect in my initial assessment. You are not Eleanor. You could not be Eleanor, but you are something equally remarkable. You are a woman who has taken an impossible situation and created something genuine from it. You are not attempting to replicate what came before. You are building something new. And the Duke, I observe, is happier than I have seen him in years. That is a genuine accomplishment." Sophie had thanked the Countess with appropriate grace, but internally she had felt something shift, a recognition that her position in society was no longer dependent on anyone's approval. She had become, through her own choices and her own capacity to navigate complex circumstances, a woman of genuine standing. Her value was no longer dependent on her husband's position or her daughter's potential. She had earned respect through her own actions and her own character. By the time they returned to Meridian Hall in December, Sophie found herself experiencing something approaching contentment that was entirely different from the resigned acceptance she had experienced in her early months of marriage. This contentment was built on genuine confidence. Confidence in her capability as a duchess, confidence in her capacity as a mother, confidence in the authenticity of her relationship with the Duke. Eleanor, now 7 months old, was beginning to sit unassisted for brief periods. She had begun to babble in that manner of infants that suggested she was experimenting with the sounds that would eventually become language. She had begun to demonstrate clear preferences for particular individuals. She brightened noticeably when the Duke approached. She seemed calmed by her grandmother's presence. She actively engaged with Elizabeth's visiting nurse, who managed her musical instruction. And she had begun to display what could only be described as a sense of humor, laughing at the various entertainments that the adults around her devised, offering what appeared to be intentional responses that suggested cognitive development well beyond her chronological age. One afternoon, as Sophie sat in the conservatory with Eleanor in her lap and the Duke in a chair beside them, she found herself reflecting on the extraordinary distance she had traveled in a single year. "Do you remember," she said to the Duke, "when you first proposed to me through your solicitor, when I believed that my life as I understood it was essentially over?" "I remember," the Duke replied, reaching over to adjust Eleanor's position with the kind of unself-conscious tenderness that still occasionally caught Sophie unaware. "I also remember being profoundly uncertain whether I was doing the right thing, whether it was fair to offer you a marriage that would confine you in a role that might feel imprisoning." "I was imprisoned," Sophie said quietly, "but not by you or by marriage. I was imprisoned by my own beliefs about what was possible, by my own acceptance of limitation, by my own willingness to accept that my life should be small and constrained. What you offered me was not a prison, but a doorway to something infinitely larger than anything I could have imagined for myself." The Duke took her hand, and Eleanor, observing this gesture, reached out with her small hand and grasped his thumb, a gesture that seemed almost to be expressing her own understanding of the connection between her parents. "I was also transformed," the Duke said quietly. "I believed that I had experienced the full arc of love and partnership, that anything beyond that would necessarily be diminished or inauthentic. You taught me that love is not a finite resource. You taught me that transformation and growth are possible at any age. You taught me that partnership can deepen and become more meaningful, even when it begins from the most practical of origins. Thank you for teaching me that." As December progressed and the year began to draw toward its close, Sophie found herself thinking about the future with a kind of purposeful optimism that had become characteristic of her perspective. Eleanor would grow. There might be more children. The estate would continue to develop and expand. The family that had begun from necessity would continue to deepen through genuine connection and shared commitment. She had been given to the Duke of Meridian because her family needed security, but in being given, she had discovered something far more valuable than security. She had discovered herself. Winter settled over Meridian Hall with the kind of quiet intensity that characterized the season in the English countryside. The landscape was transformed into what seemed almost a separate world, white with snow, silent in its own particular way, stripped of the decorative elements that other seasons provided, and reduced to its fundamental architectural forms. It was the kind of season that encouraged introspection and close familial connection, as the world beyond the estate became increasingly difficult to access, and the warmth of home became proportionally more valuable. Eleanor was now 8 months old, and had begun to demonstrate mobility. She could roll from back to belly and belly to back. She was experimenting with forward motion that suggested crawling was not far distant, and she was becoming increasingly interested in the world beyond the immediate perimeter of her caretaker's arms. The Duke had become in some ways more devoted to his daughter than to his governance of the estate, a transformation that had initially alarmed his steward, but which Sophie recognized as the natural expression of a man who had finally permitted himself to experience the full depth of paternal love. He would often excuse himself from estate business to observe Eleanor's developmental milestones. He had commissioned a series of sketches capturing her at various stages of development, and he had begun to speak with increasing frequency about Eleanor's future, her potential, her possibilities, the ways in which she might contribute to the world simply by being fully and authentically herself. What Sophie observed with increasing appreciation was that her husband's devotion to Eleanor had not diminished his devotion to her. Rather, it had deepened it. He seemed to love her not merely as a woman and a partner, but as the mother of his child, the woman who had created Eleanor, carried Eleanor, brought Eleanor into the world. His regard for her had become, if possible, even more profound than it had been in the months immediately following their wedding. One evening in late January, as snow fell heavily outside the windows of their shared bedchamber and they lay together in the darkness, the Duke had spoken of something that Sophie had not previously considered. "I have been thinking," he said, his voice carrying the quality of someone who had deliberated carefully before speaking, "about the question of succession. I have updated my will to ensure that Eleanor will have significant resources and property, that her inheritance will not be dependent on her marrying or on the decisions of others. However, I find myself hoping that Eleanor might eventually have brothers, sons who could share the responsibility of governing the estates and managing the family's interests." Sophie had been initially silent, understanding what he was asking. Another pregnancy, another period of carrying and vulnerability, another experience of the profound physical and emotional intensity that accompanied childbirth. "I would like another child," she said finally. "Specifically, I would like to give you the sons that you desire. Not merely because it would provide Eleanor with brothers, though I believe that would be valuable, but because the experience of motherhood has taught me something about myself that I did not previously understand. I am capable of love that exceeds my own needs and preferences. I am capable of creating life. I am capable of transformation at the deepest level. I would like to experience that again." The Duke had wept then, not silently, but with the kind of audible emotion that suggested genuine, overwhelming feeling. "You are extraordinary," he had said. "Do you understand how rare it is to encounter a woman who would choose to undergo the physical ordeal of pregnancy and childbirth, not from pressure or obligation, but from genuine choice. Do you understand how much your willingness to expand our family demonstrates your commitment not merely to me, but to the future that we are building together? As winter progressed towards spring, Sophie found herself gradually becoming pregnant again, the signs accumulating with a familiarity that made this pregnancy feel less shocking and more like a continuation of something that had already been initiated. The nausea that had characterized her first pregnancy was less severe. Her energy levels were more stable, and her emotional response was entirely different. This time she was not experiencing the anxiety that had accompanied her first pregnancy, but rather a kind of peaceful anticipation. Eleanor, growing and changing with remarkable speed, seemed to sense something of the shift in her mother's body. The infant had begun to demonstrate behaviors that suggested understanding beyond her chronological age. She would rest her hand on Sophie's abdomen, seeming to appreciate the slight curve that was beginning to become visible. And when the Duke would place his own hand on Sophie's belly, Eleanor would focus her attention on this gesture with what appeared to be understanding. "She is already acknowledging her sibling," the Duke said, watching Eleanor's response to this ritual. "Do you believe that children are capable of such understanding? Or am I merely projecting meaning onto her behaviors?" "I believe," Sophie replied, "that children understand far more than we generally credit them with understanding. Eleanor may not know, in the conscious sense that we understand knowing, that she will have a sibling, but I believe she understands at some deeper level that the world is preparing for change." In March, as spring began to announce its arrival with increasing confidence, Dr. Ashworth confirmed that Sophie's pregnancy was progressing excellently. The child appeared to be developing appropriately. Sophie's health was sound, and there was every indication that this pregnancy would conclude as successfully as Eleanor's had. It was during this consultation that the Duke had asked Dr. Ashworth a question that Sophie had not anticipated. "If there were any risk to my wife," he had said, his tone suggesting that this was not a casual inquiry. "If the choice were between my wife's life and the child's life, what would be your recommendation?" Dr. Ashworth had considered this question carefully before responding. "I would recommend your wife's life," he had said finally, without reservation or hesitation. "A wife, a mother to your existing child, a living woman with whom you have built partnership. These are irreplaceable losses. A child not yet born, while certainly a significant potential loss, can be grieved and accommodated in ways that the death of a living woman cannot. Your wife's life is infinitely more valuable than an unborn child's." Sophie had observed her husband's expression shift at this confirmation. She had understood in that moment that despite his excitement regarding the coming child and his desire for sons, his primary commitment was to her, that she was, in his hierarchy of values, more important than the perpetuation of the family name or the expansion of his heirs. After Dr. Ashworth had departed, the Duke had taken Sophie in his arms and held her with an intensity that suggested he was confronting the full reality of the risk that pregnancy involved, the possibility that this act of creation might result in catastrophic loss. "I love you," he had said simply. "If anything were to happen to you, if anything were ever to threaten your life or your well-being, I would not forgive myself. You must promise me that if at any point during this pregnancy you experience pain or uncertainty or fear, you will immediately tell me. You must promise me that your well-being takes absolute priority over the child's development." "I promise," Sophie had replied, and she had meant it completely. The next months became a kind of existence, suspended between present and future. Eleanor continued her development. The estate continued its seasonal rhythms. And Sophie's body once again became the vehicle through which new life was being created, a process that she had come to recognize not as imprisonment, but as extraordinary partnership with the creative force of the universe. By late April, as spring had fully arrived and the gardens of Meridian Hall were bursting into flower, Sophie found herself experiencing pregnancy with a kind of peace that she had not anticipated. This was not resignation. This was not acceptance of necessity. This was genuine joy at the prospect of expanding the family, of experiencing motherhood again, of continuing the extraordinary partnership with the Duke that had become the foundation of her entire existence. One afternoon, as she sat in the garden with Eleanor nearby on a blanket, observing her daughter as she experimented with the grass and the emerging flowers, Sophie felt the quickening, the first genuine movement of the new child that communicated its own existence and its own personality. "She is alive," Sophie said aloud, speaking to the not-yet-born child. "I feel you, I acknowledge you. I welcome you into this family that is already being shaped by your arrival." The Duke, who had been observing from a distance, came to sit beside her on the garden bench. "What are you thinking?" he asked. "I am thinking," Sophie replied, "that I understand now what I could not understand a year ago. I understand that love is not a diminishing resource. I understand that partnership deepens through shared vulnerability. I understand that the most extraordinary gift I could have received was not security or position, but the opportunity to become fully myself. Thank you for that gift." The Duke took her hand and placed it on his own heart. "The gift," he said, "was entirely reciprocal. You gave me back my life. You gave me the possibility of love extending beyond grief. You gave me the future. Thank you for that." The final months of Sophie's pregnancy passed in a kind of peaceful productivity. The estate preparations that had been deferred during Eleanor's infancy were brought to completion. The nursery was expanded to accommodate 2 young children, and plans were made with the kind of thoughtful intentionality that characterized all of Sophie and the Duke's major decisions for the expansion of the household staff to ensure that both children would receive appropriate care and attention. What surprised Sophie was how differently she experienced this pregnancy in its final stages compared to her experience with Eleanor. With Eleanor, she had been anxious, uncertain, acutely aware of the risk and the physical discomfort. This time, she moved through the weeks with a kind of grounded assurance. She had done this before. She knew what to expect. And more importantly, she knew that the outcome would be a person who would be loved and valued and recognized for their unique worth from the moment of arrival. Eleanor, now nearly a year old, was increasingly mobile and increasingly aware of the changes occurring in the household. She had begun to walk with assistance, holding onto furniture or the hands of available adults. She had begun to use sounds that seemed increasingly intentional, not yet language in the strict sense, but communication in its most fundamental form, and she had begun to demonstrate extraordinary affection for her father. The Duke seemed to be the person most capable of entertaining Eleanor during the times when Sophie needed to rest. He would walk through the corridors with her, pointing out paintings and describing the individuals they depicted. He would bring her to the library and read to her, his deep voice creating a rhythm that seemed to soothe her restless infant energy. And he had begun to tell her stories about the future, about the siblings who would arrive, about the world she would inherit, about the possibilities that lay before her. It was during one of these storytelling sessions that the Duke had made a decision that surprised even Sophie with its magnitude. "I am going to establish a trust," he had announced, "with provisions that ensure Eleanor will have control over a significant portion of her inheritance, regardless of her marital status. I want her to have genuine choices, not merely the choices available to women of her generation, but actual alternatives. If she wishes to marry, she will have the resources to marry for love. If she wishes to remain unmarried, she will have the resources to do so. I want her to have freedom." "That is extraordinary," Sophie had replied. "It is also, I suspect, radical from the perspective of most of your peers." "My peers have created a system that limits the possibilities of half of humanity," the Duke had responded with quiet firmness. "I have the opportunity to create something different for my daughter, and for any daughters I might have in the future. I intend to exercise that opportunity." By June, as Sophie's pregnancy progressed into its final weeks, the household had settled into a state of peaceful anticipation. The Duke's steward had reported that the estate had experienced an exceptionally profitable year. The improvements that Sophie had suggested had begun to yield results that exceeded even the most optimistic projections. The gardens were producing abundantly, the agricultural operations were functioning efficiently, and the financial position of the estate had strengthened considerably. Yet what the Duke seemed to value most was not the financial success, but rather the growth that Sophie had facilitated in the management of the household. She had brought to the task of estate governance a combination of practical competence and genuine concern for the people who lived and worked on the land. She had personally visited the cottages of the tenants, had become acquainted with the families who sustained the estate through their labor, and had established relationships of genuine regard rather than mere hierarchical obligation. "You have made me a better man," the Duke said to her one evening as they sat together in the library, Eleanor sleeping in her nearby cradle. "You have taught me that being a good lord, being a good human being, is not about maintaining position or perpetuating tradition. It is about recognizing the humanity of those around you and creating circumstances in which that humanity can flourish. In early July, as the summer heat began to build and Sophie's physical discomfort increased proportionally, Dr. Ashworth confirmed that the child would likely arrive within the next few weeks. Sophie found herself, unlike during her first pregnancy, entirely ready for the experience. She had moved through the anticipatory anxiety and had arrived at a kind of peaceful acceptance. She knew what labor would bring. She knew that she was capable of surviving it, and she knew that the result would be profoundly worthwhile. It was on July 19th that labor began, early morning, quiet and gentle in its initial manifestations, gradually building into the intensity that would culminate in birth. The Duke was present immediately, having apparently been anticipating this event and having arranged to sleep in the adjacent chamber so that he might be available the moment labor commenced. This labor was shorter than Eleanor's had been. Sophie's body, having already completed this process once, seemed to move through it with greater efficiency. By midday, as the sun poured through the windows of the birthing chamber, Sophie felt the intensity of pushing that would result in birth. "It is a son," the midwife announced, and Sophie heard the Duke's sharp intake of breath, a sound that communicated the magnitude of what this announcement meant to him. The child was placed on her chest, and Sophie found herself looking at her son, a perfect, healthy, remarkably calm infant with dark hair and his father's bone structure. Where Eleanor had announced her arrival with indignation, this child seemed almost contemplative, observing the world with the kind of calm assessment that suggested he was taking inventory of everything he encountered. "James," the Duke said, his voice carrying absolute certainty. "His name will be James after the brother I lost when I was a child. I believe that is appropriate." Sophie had not known about a deceased brother, another piece of the Duke's history that he had apparently been saving for the right moment to share. She would learn in the days following James's birth that the Duke's younger brother had died at age 6 from a childhood illness, and that this loss had shaped the Duke's understanding of mortality and his appreciation for those he loved. In the weeks following James's birth, the household settled into a new rhythm, one that involved 2 young children rather than one. Eleanor, now just over a year old, was simultaneously fascinated and slightly disturbed by the arrival of her brother. She would approach the sleeping infant with cautious curiosity, seemingly attempting to understand what this new person represented. Sophie found motherhood to be profoundly different with the second child than with the first. Where Eleanor had represented a kind of unknown territory that Sophie had to navigate with considerable anxiety, James represented a territory that she had already mapped. She knew what to expect. She knew how to respond to different cries. She knew the rhythms and patterns of newborn development. And most importantly, she knew that she was capable of managing the physical and emotional demands of mothering 2 young children simultaneously. By late August, as the summer began its gradual transition into autumn, Sophie found herself in the conservatory one afternoon, sitting with James sleeping against her shoulder, while Eleanor played on a blanket nearby with some of the simple toys that had been provided for her amusement. The Duke entered and stood observing the scene, his wife with both of his children, the visual manifestation of the partnership and the future that they had built together. "Do you remember," he said, moving to sit beside her, "when you believed your life was essentially over, when you accepted my proposal from desperation and necessity?" "I remember," Sophie replied. "I remember believing that I was sacrificing my future for security. I remember the grief of accepting that possibility." "And now?" the Duke asked. "Now I understand that I was not sacrificing my future," Sophie said quietly. "I was being offered the opportunity to build one. I was being given by a man I did not know, the chance to become someone I could not have become without that gift." The Duke reached out and gently touched James's sleeping face with a single finger, the kind of delicate gesture that communicated extraordinary tenderness. "I believe we have built something remarkable," he said. "I believe we have created not merely a marriage, but a family. I believe we have created a legacy. And I believe we have demonstrated that genuine partnership, genuine love, genuine commitment, these are possible across the seemingly impossible distances of age and circumstance." As autumn arrived once again, painting the gardens of Meridian Hall in shades of gold and crimson, Sophie understood that she had arrived at the destination she had not known she was seeking. She had been given to the Duke because her family needed security. But in being given, she had discovered something infinitely more valuable, the possibility of being fully known and fully valued by another human being. She had discovered the capacity to create life. She had discovered the strength that comes from vulnerability. and she had discovered that the greatest transformations in human experience often come from the most unexpected sources. The young woman who had wept for her lost youth had become a woman who was grateful for every moment of the unexpected future that had been given to her. Autumn settled over Meridian Hall with a different quality than it had possessed in previous years. The landscape was familiar, yet everything was transformed by the presence of two young children. The gardens, which had previously been the Duke's private domain and Sophie's refuge, had become places where Eleanor practiced her increasingly confident walking and where James was introduced to the natural world in his first months of awareness. The household had adjusted to the presence of infants with remarkable efficiency. The nursery staff had been expanded to include an additional nurse and a governess, who would eventually oversee Eleanor's education. The household routines had been reorganized to accommodate the feeding schedules and sleep patterns of two children at different developmental stages. And Sophie, having now experienced motherhood twice, had begun to develop the kind of confident authority regarding her children's care that suggested she was not merely surviving the demands of motherhood, but actually flourishing within it. What struck the Duke most profoundly was how naturally Sophie had become the kind of mother that every child deserved, present without being obsessive, protective without being controlling, loving without losing sight of the necessity of teaching her children to navigate the world independently. He observed her teaching Eleanor to walk, providing just enough support that the child felt secure while allowing enough independence that Eleanor could develop her own sense of balance and capability. He observed her with James, responding to his needs with efficiency and warmth, but also permitting him to experience minor discomforts that would teach him that not every discomfort was catastrophic. "You are going to produce extraordinary humans," he had said to her one afternoon, as they watched Eleanor attempt to climb the shallow steps leading to the garden terrace. "I am attempting to produce humans who understand their own capacity," Sophie had replied. "I think there is a significant difference between caring for children and enabling them. The former is what I hope to accomplish. The latter I am actively avoiding." By October, Eleanor had become a walking toddler of remarkable confidence, not yet fully verbal, but communicating with increasing clarity through a combination of gesture and sound. She was extraordinarily social, greeting household staff with the kind of democratic friendliness that suggested she made no meaningful distinctions between herself and the adults around her based on their station. James, by contrast, had revealed himself to be a child of contemplative temperament. Where Eleanor was perpetually engaged with the external world, James seemed to spend significant time in internal observation. He would watch his sister's activities with interest, but he did not seem driven by the same compulsion to participate. He was content to be held, to observe, to process the information his senses were bringing him. "He has your analytical nature," Sophie had observed to the Duke. "Eleanor has your social grace and your capacity for command, but James has your ability to observe a situation carefully before responding to it. And Eleanor has your courage," the Duke had replied. "The kind of courage that does not consist of the absence of fear, but rather of the willingness to move forward despite fear. That is the quality I most admired in you when I first began to understand you." It was during this period that the Duke had begun to receive visitors with increasing frequency, neighbors and distant relations who had heard about Eleanor and James and who wished to pay their respects. What the Duke had anticipated would be somewhat tedious social obligation had instead become an opportunity to observe how firmly established Sophie's position had become in the eyes of society. The wives of the neighboring landowners treated her with genuine warmth. The mothers of eligible daughters, some of whom might have briefly considered the young Duchess a potential rival, seemed to regard her with a mixture of respect and what appeared to be genuine affection. The older women, who might have been skeptical regarding the wisdom of the Duke's marriage to a woman so substantially younger, seemed to have become entirely convinced of the marriage's success. "Your wife has been the making of you," Lord Ashworth, a neighboring baronet, had said to the Duke during one of these visits. "You are a different man than you were 5 years ago, when Eleanor, forgive me, your first wife, Eleanor, was still living. You are more engaged with the world, more genuinely warm in your interactions. I attribute this entirely to your marriage to the Duchess." The Duke had accepted this observation with grace, but privately he had reflected on how accurate the assessment was. His marriage to Sophie had literally remade him. He had believed in the 5 years following his first wife's death that the best years of his life were behind him, that he could look forward only to a kind of slow diminishment, a gradual withdrawal from engagement with the world. Instead, he had discovered that transformation was possible, that genuine partnership could emerge from the most unlikely of circumstances, and that the capacity for love and connection was not exhausted by one significant relationship. In November, the Duke had made a formal announcement to the household staff regarding the future plans for the estate. He had decided that Eleanor would inherit not merely a title, but also a significant portion of the Meridian estates, not the entailed portions that would necessarily pass to the male heir, but sufficient property and wealth that she would never be dependent on her husband's goodwill or her brother's generosity. When James was older, there would be discussions about sharing responsibility for the administration of the estates between both children, should Eleanor choose to remain involved. This decision had generated considerable discussion among the household staff, but what surprised the Duke was that the primary response seemed to be approval rather than objection. Sophie's approach to household management, her recognition that the people who worked at Meridian Hall were fully human rather than merely functional units, had apparently created an environment in which innovation and forward thinking were valued rather than seen as threats to tradition. Your Grace, Mrs. Coleman, the midwife who had assisted with both births and who had remained at Meridian Hall as a kind of informal household advisor regarding matters of child development, had said to the Duke, "Miss Eleanor is a fortunate girl. Not every father would ensure his daughter's independence regardless of her marital circumstances. Miss Eleanor," the Duke had replied, "will live in a world that I cannot fully anticipate. I want her to have choices, genuine choices, not merely the appearance of choice. If she wishes to marry, she will marry for love, not for security. If she wishes to remain unmarried, she will have the resources to do so. That seems to me the very foundation of ensuring her well-being." As December approached, bringing with it the season of celebration and family gathering, Meridian Hall began to be transformed into a place of festive preparation. Eleanor was old enough to take interest in the decorations, pointing at the holly and the candles and the evergreen garlands with the kind of absorbed attention that suggested she was attempting to understand the purpose of these sudden additions to her familiar world. James, now 3 months old, was beginning to demonstrate the earliest signs of genuine responsiveness to the world beyond his own physical needs. He would track movement with his eyes. He would respond to voices, seeming to recognize his parents and the familiar caregivers who attended to him, and he had begun to smile. Not the reflexive smile of younger infants, but genuine smiles that appeared to express recognition and pleasure. One afternoon, as the household prepared for the Christmas season, the Duke came to find Sophie in the nursery, where she was supervising the arrangement of furniture to ensure that Eleanor had safe space to practice her increasingly confident walking. "I have been thinking," he said, settling himself in a chair that had been positioned for parental observation, "about the question of legacy and what it means to create one. I believed for much of my life that legacy was primarily a matter of maintaining property and perpetuating the family name. But you have taught me that legacy is actually something far more significant. It is the transmission of values, the creation of relationships, the establishment of patterns of genuine care and concern." Sophie paused in her activity and turned to him with the kind of full attention that she had learned to give when he spoke about something that clearly mattered to him. "Our children," he continued, "will inherit property and position, but more importantly, they will inherit the example of a partnership built from vulnerability and genuine regard. They will inherit the understanding that love is not a finite resource, but something that expands through sharing. They will inherit, I hope, the knowledge that their worth is inherent rather than dependent on accomplishment or status. That is the legacy I actually care about perpetuating." "They will inherit exactly that," Sophie said quietly, moving to sit beside him, "because every day, through your actions and your choices, you demonstrate these values. Eleanor will grow to understand her own worth because you treat her as though her thoughts and feelings matter. James will develop his own understanding of what partnership looks like because he will observe, throughout his childhood, the genuine regard and respect between his parents." The Duke reached over and took her hand, a gesture that had become so habitual between them that it seemed almost like an extension of breathing. "Thank you," he said simply. "Thank you for becoming the woman you have become, for teaching me what I needed to learn, for building this family with me." As Christmas approached and the household settled into the rhythms of holiday preparation, Sophie found herself experiencing a kind of profound peace. This time last year, she had been in the early months of her pregnancy with Eleanor, uncertain about nearly everything. Now she was the mother of 2 children, the established duchess of a significant estate, and the genuine partner of a man who valued her, not for her utility, but for her essential self. The transformation was complete. The girl who had wept for her lost youth had become a woman who was grateful for every moment of the unexpected life she had been given. Christmas arrived with the kind of perfect whiteness that seemed almost like a blessing from benevolent natural forces. Meridian Hall was transformed into a place of celebration and warmth. The great hall was decorated with greenery and candles, the kitchens produced elaborate feasts that would continue throughout the season, and the household settled into that peculiar timelessness that characterized the holidays. Eleanor, now nearly 18 months old, was capable of genuine participation in the festivities. She could clap her hands to music, she could be taught to wave in response to Christmas carols being sung, and she had begun to demonstrate the kind of sophisticated understanding of social situations that suggested her development was proceeding at a pace that was somewhat advanced for her age. James, now 5 months old, was beginning to sit unassisted for brief periods, a developmental milestone that seemed to delight his father perhaps more than it delighted the child himself. The Duke would spend considerable time in the nursery, simply observing his son's gradually expanding capability, offering quiet encouragement without exerting pressure. What Sophie observed with increasing appreciation was how completely the Duke had integrated his identity as a father with his identity as Duke. He did not view these roles as competing. He seemed rather to view fatherhood as the most important aspect of his identity. Estate business was conducted with efficiency, but it was conducted in such a way that it did not interfere with his commitment to his children. It was during the Christmas season that the Duke had made an announcement that had taken Sophie somewhat by surprise, though she recognized it as entirely consistent with the evolution of his thinking. "I am going to reduce my involvement in certain estate matters," he had told her, as they sat together in the library after Eleanor had been put to bed and James was sleeping in his nearby cradle. "I have spent much of my life believing that my primary responsibility was to the perpetuation of wealth and property, but I have come to understand that my primary responsibility is to my family, to ensuring that Eleanor and James have a father who is genuinely present in their lives, who models what commitment and care look like, who teaches them through his actions rather than through his words alone." "Will the steward be capable of managing those additional responsibilities?" Sophie asked, though she was already confident in the answer. "The steward has been more than capable of managing them," the Duke replied. "I have been managing them primarily because I believed that was what was expected of me, that a duke should be perpetually engaged with the business of his estates. But I have learned through watching you manage motherhood with such grace that sometimes the most important work we can do is the work that is most intimate and most personal. I intend to follow your example." As December progressed toward its conclusion, the Duke made another announcement that had significant implications for the future structure of the household. He had decided that Sophie would, beginning in the new year, assume primary responsibility for the management of the London residence. This would require that she spend several months each year in the city, maintaining the social connections that were necessary for the family's position, ensuring that the house was appropriately maintained, and overseeing the social calendar that would eventually become important for Eleanor's entrance into society. "I will not wish to be separated from you," he had said carefully, understanding that this might seem like a rejection or a diminishment of her role at Meridian Hall. "However, I recognize that you have developed extraordinary capability in the management of great households, and I believe that you should exercise those capabilities fully. Additionally, I believe it is important that Eleanor and James understand that their mother is a woman of significant responsibility and influence, not merely a woman whose life is organized around the demands of children and husband." What Sophie had heard beneath these words was his recognition that she had become something larger than merely his wife or merely the mother of his children. She had become a full human being with her own capabilities and her own sphere of influence, and he was offering her the opportunity to exercise that expanded identity. "I will need to ensure that appropriate arrangements are made for Eleanor and James during my absences," Sophie had said practically. "I will remain here," the Duke had replied. "I will manage the estates and oversee the children's care, but you will establish yourself in London as the Duchess of Meridian in full fact as well as in title. You will manage the household there. You will participate in the social season. You will build the connections that our family will require as Eleanor and James grow and develop." New Year arrived with a sense of anticipation and possibility. The household staff at Meridian Hall had been informed of the arrangements, and preparations began immediately for Sophie's more active engagement with the London residents. A superior governess was engaged to assist with the children's care during Sophie's absences. Additional staff was hired for the London house. And Sophie began the process of reacquainting herself with the city that had been the source of so much anxiety in her younger years. What she discovered, upon returning to London in late January, was that the city had changed, or more precisely, that her relationship to the city had transformed. She was no longer a desperate young woman attempting to escape poverty. She was the Duchess of Meridian, a woman of established position and considerable means, a woman whose social standing was beyond question. The response from London society was remarkably warm. The wives of prominent families who had been skeptical regarding her marriage now seemed to regard her with genuine interest and approval. Invitations to social gatherings arrived with increasing frequency, and Sophie found herself, somewhat to her surprise, actually enjoying the social season in a way that she had never anticipated. It was during a particularly elegant dinner hosted by the Countess of Wellington that someone made a comment that crystallized for Sophie the magnitude of the journey she had undertaken. "Your Grace," a younger woman, newly married to a baron, had said, "I have heard the story of your marriage, that it began as a practical arrangement between your family and the Duke. But anyone observing you together can see that it has become something far more genuine. How did you manage such a transformation?" Sophie had paused before responding, considering how to articulate something that she had lived, but had not attempted to explicitly explain. "I believe," she had said finally, "that transformation becomes possible when both people are willing to be vulnerable, when both people are willing to see each other authentically rather than through the lens of expectation or assumption. The Duke chose to see me as a full human being rather than as a solution to his need for an heir, and I chose to see him not as a burden I was being forced to bear, but as an opportunity to become something larger than I had believed possible. When both parties are genuinely attempting to see each other clearly, genuine partnership becomes possible." The younger woman had listened attentively, and Sophie had recognized in her expression the kind of hunger for wisdom that comes from someone navigating her own uncertain relationship circumstances. As February progressed, Sophie found herself establishing a genuine presence in London. She attended various social events with confidence. She oversaw the management of the London residence with the kind of intelligent attention that had characterized her management of Meridian Hall, and she began to build relationships with women of influence in ways that would eventually benefit Eleanor and James as they grew and eventually required entry into society. But Sophie found herself, despite the genuine pleasure she took in these activities, increasingly missing her family. She missed Eleanor's enthusiastic demonstrations of newly acquired capabilities. She missed James's slowly expanding awareness of the world, and she missed the Duke's quiet presence and his steady regard. She had been in London for 6 weeks when a letter arrived from the Duke that conveyed something unexpected. "I find myself profoundly missing you," he had written, his handwriting more hurried and less controlled than usual, suggesting genuine emotional intensity. "I have attempted to tell myself that this is appropriate, that you are fulfilling important functions here, and that my missing you should not distract you from that work. However, I have come to recognize that concealing my feelings from you has become a habit that I should have relinquished long ago. I miss you. Eleanor asks for you frequently. James seems to sense your absence in ways that I do not fully understand. And I have discovered that the most important work I can do regarding the governance of these estates is considerably less important to me than your presence." Reading this letter, Sophie had recognized something fundamental about the man she had married. He loved her with a kind of absolute commitment that transcended social convention or practical consideration. He had permitted her to go to London because he believed it was important for her development and for their family's future. But his love for her was not diminished by that absence. It was present in every moment of her departure, expressed in his careful management of their children and waiting for her return. She had made the decision, then and there, that while she would continue her responsibilities in London, she would do so in a way that minimized her separation from her family. She would manage the house efficiently and establish their social presence, but she would not permit those responsibilities to consume her in the way that ambition might have for a woman without her particular commitment to her family. As spring arrived in London and the social season reached its peak, Sophie found herself navigating the complex dynamics of society with an expertise that surprised her. She had come into this position as an outsider, a woman who had married an older duke for practical reasons, who had no established connections among the city's most influential families, who might reasonably have been expected to be somewhat overwhelmed by the demands of managing a major London residence. Instead, she had discovered that her combination of intelligence, genuine warmth, and willingness to be authentically herself made her a woman of considerable appeal. The wives of prominent families recognized in her someone who was genuinely interested in their ideas and their perspectives, rather than someone who was primarily concerned with social status, and her obvious devotion to her children and her husband, evident in the way she managed her time and in the genuine emotion she expressed regarding her family, seemed to resonate with other women who might have felt similarly divided between their public and private responsibilities. "For you have become one of the most influential women in London," the Countess of Wellington had observed one afternoon as they were taking tea together at the Duchess's residence. "And the remarkable thing is that you seem to have achieved this influence without employing any of the manipulative tactics that many women resort to. You simply treat people with respect and genuine regard, and somehow that generates a kind of loyalty and support that money cannot buy." What Sophie had not explicitly acknowledged even to herself was that this trajectory, from desperate young woman to influential duchess, had been possible only because the Duke had provided her with the foundation of emotional security that permitted her to grow. If he had been even slightly less generous, even slightly less committed to her genuine well-being, she would have remained confined within the narrow boundaries of her original circumstances. It was during this period that correspondence from Meridian Hall had begun to convey the increasing complexity of family life. Eleanor, now almost 2 years old, was beginning to display the stubborn independence that often characterizes children of this age. She wanted to walk everywhere rather than being carried. She wanted to feed herself rather than being fed. And she was beginning to demonstrate strong opinions regarding nearly everything, expressed through combinations of words and emphatic gestures that left no doubt regarding her intentions. James, nearly 8 months old, was beginning to crawl and was displaying the kind of relentless curiosity that would apparently characterize his temperament. The Duke reported that James had been found on at least 3 occasions attempting to scale the stairs, that he had become fascinated with the objects on shelves and tables, and that he seemed determined to experience everything in his environment through whatever combination of senses he could bring to bear. "Eleanor is your daughter entirely," the Duke had written. "She has your determination and your willingness to persist despite obstacle. James appears to have inherited my compulsion to understand things in their full complexity before accepting them. I suspect we will raise 2 quite different human beings." In May, the Duke had written a letter that had conveyed something more significant than the usual reports of household events and children's development. "I have been thinking," he had written, "about the concept of legacy and how profoundly my understanding of it has changed since I married you. For much of my life, I believed that legacy was something I would create, something I would establish through careful management of resources and properties, something I would leave behind when I departed this world. But I have come to understand that legacy is not something one creates in isolation. It is something that emerges through relationship, through genuine partnership, through the daily choices that 2 people make regarding how they will treat each other and how they will raise the humans that they bring into the world. I want Eleanor and James to inherit primarily the understanding that genuine love and genuine partnership are possible. I want them to understand that marriage is not an institution designed to trap one or limit one, but rather a framework within which human beings can grow and develop beyond what they might achieve alone. You have taught me this understanding, and through you, you will teach it to our children. That is the legacy that matters to me." Reading this letter, Sophie had found herself weeping, not from sadness, but from the overwhelming recognition of how profoundly she was valued by this man. She had come into the marriage expecting to be merely useful, merely adequate, merely sufficient to fulfill a particular function. Instead, she had been recognized and appreciated as a full human being whose existence and whose choices mattered to the future in profound ways. It was during late May, as the social season was reaching its conclusion, that Sophie made the decision to return to Meridian Hall several weeks earlier than had been originally planned. She had established sufficient social connections. The London residence was well managed, and she found herself increasingly impatient with the demands of city social life when weighed against her desire to be with her family. "I will return for the summer," she had announced to the household staff. "I will arrange for Mrs. Sterling to manage the residence during my absence, with instructions to prepare for the winter season when I return in the autumn. But I find that I'm not constituted to be separated from my children and my husband for extended periods." The journey to Meridian Hall in early June was undertaken with considerable anticipation. Sophie had been in London for nearly 5 months, far longer than she had anticipated remaining there. She had missed Eleanor's development from 18 months to nearly 2 years old. She had missed James's transformation from relatively immobile infant to actively crawling, exploring creature of considerable determination. When the carriage arrived at Meridian Hall, it was late afternoon. The gardens were bursting into flower. The roses that the Duke had particularly favoured were in full bloom, creating walls of colour that seemed almost impossibly vivid. And standing at the entrance of the house, as though they had been positioned there awaiting her arrival, were the Duke with Eleanor in his arms and James in a specially constructed carrying device that had been designed to permit James to observe the world while remaining secure. Sophie had barely exited the carriage before Eleanor was reaching toward her with the kind of emphatic gestures that left no doubt regarding her desire to be in her mother's arms. The child's language was still limited. She had acquired perhaps 15 words, but the emotional intensity of her response to her mother's arrival required no language at all. "Mama," Eleanor had said, the word a kind of joyful proclamation. "Mama, home." And Sophie, holding her daughter close, had felt the last vestiges of any remaining doubt regarding the choices she had made. She had been given to this man because her family needed security, but through that gift she had acquired something infinitely more valuable: a life worth living, a purpose beyond mere survival, a family that valued her not for what she could do, but for who she was. "Welcome home," the Duke had said simply, and in those 2 words Sophie had heard the recognition that this place, Meridian Hall, this man, these children, had become her true home. Summer at Meridian Hall was characterized by a rhythm that felt, to Sophie, like the most perfect expression of what life could be, when one was genuinely present for it. Eleanor, at nearly 2 years old, had become a small person of definite opinions and increasing capability. She could walk with confidence, could communicate with increasing clarity, and could demonstrate affection with an intensity that sometimes seemed almost overwhelming. James, at nearly 9 months old, was actively exploring his environment in ways that required constant vigilance. He was crawling with determination, pulling himself up on furniture and on the legs of adults, displaying a fearlessness that seemed entirely unconcerned with the possibility of falling. And he had begun to babble with increasing intentionality, not yet words, but clear demonstrations that language development was progressing according to appropriate patterns. What struck Sophie most profoundly about this period was how ordinary it was. There were no dramatic moments, no extraordinary events. There was simply the daily machinery of family life. Breakfast with the children, watching Eleanor practice her increasing competence, ensuring that James had appropriate objects with which to explore safely. There were afternoons in the garden, Sophie sitting while the children played in supervised freedom. There were evenings spent with the Duke, reviewing the day's events, discussing the children's development, sharing the kind of intimate conversation that can only occur between 2 people who have come to genuinely know each other. It was during one of these ordinary evenings in early July that the Duke had made an observation that seemed to crystallize something Sophie had been thinking without quite articulating. "Do you realize," he had said, as they sat in the library while Eleanor slept in her nearby cradle, and James was settling for the night in the adjacent nursery, "that this is what I most feared in the years after Eleanor died? I feared that I would never again experience this, the simple contentment of sitting beside someone you love, without any particular need to speak or accomplish anything, simply existing in companionship." "And now?" Sophie asked, though she already knew the answer. "Now I understand," the Duke replied, "that this kind of ordinary contentment is perhaps the highest achievement a human being can accomplish. It requires nothing but genuine love, genuine acceptance of another person, and the willingness to be present for the moments that comprise actual life, rather than always looking forward to some future that might never arrive. You have taught me this understanding through the simple fact of your presence." In August, Eleanor turned 2 years old, and the household prepared to celebrate this milestone. The child's second birthday seemed to represent a kind of threshold. She was no longer merely an infant, but had become a small child with clear personality and increasing independence. The birthday celebration was conducted with the kind of loving attention that characterized all of the Duke's interactions with his children. There was a special cake, decorated with painstaking care. There were small gifts, nothing elaborate but chosen with obvious thought regarding what Eleanor might enjoy. And there was a family gathering that included not only the core family, but also Margaret, who had remained at Meridian Hall throughout the summer, and Elizabeth, who had travelled from her own residence to participate in the celebration. What struck those observing the celebration was how thoroughly Eleanor had already integrated herself into the family identity. She was not merely tolerated or endured, she was genuinely delighted in, her emerging personality celebrated, her increasing capability encouraged and appreciated. "She is going to be a remarkable woman," Elizabeth had said to Sophie during the celebration. "She has her father's essential character, the capacity for genuine regard, the willingness to see people as full human beings, but she has your intelligence and your determination. She will accomplish extraordinary things." As August progressed toward September, and the realization began to dawn that the summer period was drawing toward its close, Sophie found herself considering how dramatically her life had transformed in the span of merely 18 months. She had been a desperate young woman accepting a marriage born of necessity. Now she was a woman of established position, the confident mother of 2 children, the genuine partner of a man who valued her beyond measure. The external circumstances of her life had certainly changed. She had security, position, comfort, but the internal transformation had been far more significant. She had come to understand her own worth. She had discovered capabilities she had never suspected herself of possessing. She had learned to build genuine partnerships, and most significantly, she had learned to receive love with the same wholehearted commitment that she offered love. On the final evening of August, as she and the Duke sat together in the conservatory with both children sleeping nearby, Sophie had found herself simply grateful. Grateful for the specific man beside her, grateful for the children who represented the future, grateful for the extraordinary sequence of events that had brought her to this place at this moment. "Do you ever regret it?" the Duke asked suddenly. "Do you ever wonder what your life might have been if you had refused my proposal?" Sophie considered the question with genuine attention. There had been moments of difficulty, the discomfort of pregnancy, the challenge of postpartum recovery, the complexity of navigating society and household management. But none of these difficulties had ever made her wish that her life had followed a different trajectory. "No," she said finally, "I do not regret it. I regret the desperation that made the marriage necessary. I regret the circumstances that created that desperation. But I do not regret the choice that I made or the consequences of that choice. I believe I would have been diminished by any other path. I believe I would have remained confined within the boundaries of my original circumstances. You gave me the opportunity to become fully myself. I am profoundly grateful for that gift." The Duke reached over and took her hand, and Sophie felt that familiar gesture communicate something that went beyond words. He was grateful. He was committed. He loved her not with the intensity of first love or the desperation of passionate attraction, but with the deep, steady regard that comes from truly knowing another person and choosing, day after day, to build something genuine with them. As September arrived and the household prepared for the transition of seasons, Meridian Hall settled into the kind of profound peace that comes from genuine family connection. Eleanor was developing into a small person of remarkable character. James was growing with appropriate speed and demonstrating every indication of becoming a thoughtful, intelligent child. And Sophie and the Duke had built something that extended far beyond the practical arrangement that had initiated their marriage. They had built a genuine partnership, genuine family, genuine love. The young woman who had wept for her lost youth had become a woman who was grateful for every moment of the unexpected life she had been given. October arrived with the kind of golden perfection that seemed almost like a benediction. The leaves were turning to rich colors, reds and golds and deep oranges that transformed the landscape of Meridian Hall into something that seemed almost deliberately beautiful. The weather was cool, but not yet cold, permitting the kind of outdoor activity that Sophie had come to associate with genuine well-being and presence. Eleanor, now well established in her second year of life, had developed into a small person of considerable personality and charm. She had acquired perhaps 30 words, which she wielded with impressive intentionality. She had strong opinions about most matters: what she wished to eat, where she wished to go, whom she wished to interact with. And she had developed a sense of humor that suggested she understood not merely the world, but also the subtle ways that humans could find amusement together. James, nearly a year old, had evolved into an active, exploring creature of remarkable determination. He had mastered the fine art of pulling himself upright and was making initial attempts at taking steps while holding onto furniture. He was developing a distinct personality, quieter than his sister, more observant, seemingly content to study the world before fully engaging with it. Where Eleanor approached experience with enthusiasm and immediate response, James seemed to be taking inventory, categorizing, developing his own internal understanding of how things functioned. What the Duke observed about his two children was that they appeared to be evolving into people who would be both similar and distinct. They would share certain fundamental values and approaches to life, both having been raised by parents who emphasized the importance of genuine regard for other human beings, both having inherited a capacity for intelligent observation and analysis. But they would be entirely different in temperament and approach, Eleanor driven by action and social engagement, James driven by understanding and internal reflection. They will either be the most formidable partnership or the most significant source of conflict in each other's lives, the Duke had observed to Sophie. I suspect it will be both, alternately, throughout their existence. It was during early October that Margaret had announced her intention to return to London. She had spent the entire year at Meridian Hall, having initially come to support Sophie through the pregnancy and recovery following James's birth. Now, with Sophie firmly established in her role as Duchess and Eleanor, and James thriving, Margaret felt that her presence was no longer as essential. "I have been thinking," she had said to Sophie, as they sat together in the garden one afternoon with Eleanor playing nearby and James investigating the structure of a particular flower with absorbed concentration, "about what to do with the remainder of my life. I have the financial security that you have provided. I have no need to depend on anyone's generosity or goodwill. For the first time in my adult life, I have genuine choice regarding how I wish to spend my time." "What are you considering?" Sophie asked, intuiting that her mother had been contemplating this decision for some time. "I am considering returning to London," Margaret replied, "not to the cramped lodgings where I lived in poverty, but to a modest but respectable house, where I might establish myself in a kind of independence that I never anticipated being possible. There are charitable organizations in London that are always seeking support from women who have time and resources, and the desire to be genuinely useful. I believe I might find meaning in such work." Sophie had felt a complicated emotion upon hearing this, sadness that her mother would be leaving, but also pride and appreciation for her mother's recognition that she had grown beyond the role of merely supporting her daughter. Margaret was becoming, in her own right, a woman of significance and purpose. "You should do exactly that," Sophie had said warmly. "You have earned the right to define your own life according to your own preferences, and I suspect you will accomplish remarkable things." The Duke had been equally supportive and had immediately begun making arrangements that would ensure Margaret's transition to London would be comfortable and appropriate. He had identified a suitable residence, had ensured that her financial arrangements were secured, and had provided her with introductions to women of influence who might facilitate her entry into charitable work. As Margaret prepared to depart, the household had organized a small gathering. Not a formal farewell, but a kind of celebration of the year they had shared together and acknowledgement of the transformation that had occurred within the family structure. "You came to Meridian Hall a year ago," Elizabeth had said to Margaret, "believing that your primary role was to support your daughter. You are leaving as a woman of independence and purpose. That is a remarkable achievement." With Margaret's departure, the household at Meridian Hall underwent a subtle shift. Eleanor and James would not have their grandmother's daily presence, though Margaret had made clear her intention to visit frequently. But the family unit, the Duke, Sophie, and the two children, had become more fully defined as its own entity. It was on a particularly perfect afternoon in late October that the Duke had suggested to Sophie that they take a walk together, leaving Eleanor and James in the care of their nurse, and go to the specific place in the gardens where they had first truly conversed, the conservatory that had become, over the course of their marriage, a kind of sanctuary, where they conducted their most important exchanges. When they arrived at the space, Sophie found that the Duke had arranged something unexpected. Candles had been positioned throughout the room, flowers had been arranged in careful display, and a chair had been positioned for Sophie to sit upon, while the Duke remained standing before her. "I am going to say some things that I should have said much more directly and much earlier in our relationship," the Duke had begun, and Sophie had seen in his expression the intensity of emotion that he was experiencing. I am going to articulate what I believe regarding our marriage and regarding you, because these things are too important to remain merely implied or assumed." He had paused, and Sophie had waited, understanding that this moment was significant and that he had carefully prepared what he intended to communicate. "When I proposed to you," he had continued, "it was from practical consideration. I required a wife. Your circumstances made you a suitable candidate. I believed I was offering you security and position in exchange for companionship and the possibility of children. That was the arrangement as I understood it." Sophie had listened, knowing that this was not the complete truth of what had actually transpired, but understanding that he was establishing the context for what he intended to say. "But from the very first moment that I met you in person, I recognized something in you that went far beyond suitability," he had said. "I recognized genuine intelligence. I recognized capability. I recognized profound feeling masked by resignation. And I recognized the possibility that you might, with appropriate support, become the woman you were always meant to be." He had moved to where she was seated and had taken her hand. "It has been the privilege of my life to witness that becoming," he had said, his voice carrying absolute conviction. "It has been the honor of my existence to be the person to whom you granted your trust and your partnership. Sophie, I love you, not as a benefactor loves a grateful recipient, not as a husband loves a dutiful wife, but as a human being loves another human being who has become essential to their existence. I love the woman you are, and I love the woman you are continuing to become. I am grateful every moment that you accepted my proposal, and I am grateful every moment since that you have chosen to remain committed to this partnership." Sophie had wept then, not from sadness but from the overwhelming recognition of being so thoroughly valued and so genuinely loved. "I love you too," she had replied. "I love you in ways that I did not think were possible. I love you not despite the age difference or the circumstances of how we met, but because of how you have treated me, how you have valued me, how you have permitted and encouraged me to become fully myself. Thank you for seeing me. Thank you for believing in me. Thank you for loving me." They had held each other in the candle-lit conservatory, and Sophie had felt a kind of absolute completion, not the end of her journey, but rather the recognition that the fundamental work of building genuine partnership had been accomplished. The rest of their lives would be the continuation of what had been established. When they returned to the house as evening was settling into the landscape, Eleanor was waiting at the window for them, pressing her face against the glass with the kind of enthusiastic anticipation that children display for parents who have been absent for even brief periods. "Mama, Papa!" she had cried out when they entered, and both parents had scooped her into their arms. In her cradle nearby, James had been stirring toward wakefulness, beginning the process of asserting his own need for attention and care. Sophie had looked at this scene, her husband and daughter, the infant who would wake soon requiring her immediate attention, the household staff attending to the thousand small details that maintained the operation of a great estate, and had understood something fundamental. She had been given to this man because her family needed security. But in being given, she had received something far more valuable, herself. She had been offered a marriage and had discovered genuine partnership. She had been offered position and had discovered purpose. She had been offered a future and had discovered that the future, when lived fully and authentically, contained more joy than she could have possibly anticipated. The young woman who had wept for her lost youth had become a woman who was profoundly grateful for every unexpected moment of the life she had been given. The transformation was complete, and the journey, from desperation to joy, from resignation to active choice, from isolation to genuine partnership, had become the foundation upon which all future moments would be built. 5 years had passed since that October afternoon in the conservatory, when the Duke had made his formal declaration of love. 5 years seemed, in the reckoning of ordinary time, to be a relatively brief span. Yet when measured in the lived experience of a growing family, 5 years represented an extraordinary arc of transformation and development. Eleanor was now 7 years old, no longer a small child, but a girl on the cusp of that particular threshold that separated early childhood from the beginnings of independence. She was tall for her age, with her mother's ash-blonde hair and her father's decisive manner. She was proving to be precisely what the Duke had anticipated, a child of remarkable intelligence and genuine warmth, a girl who seemed to understand instinctively that other people possessed feelings and perspectives worthy of consideration. Her education had been carefully arranged. She had a governess who was exceptional, a woman of considerable learning who believed that girls should be educated as thoroughly as boys, that intellectual capability had no gender, that the future would require women who could think critically and argue persuasively. The Duke had been adamant regarding Eleanor's education in a way that suggested he understood, with clarity, that the world Eleanor would inherit would be different from the world of his own childhood. James was now 5 years old, and he had evolved precisely as observers might have predicted based on his early temperament. He was a thoughtful child, preferring observation to immediate action, demonstrating a kind of systematic approach to understanding how things functioned. He had already demonstrated considerable aptitude for mathematics and language. He could read simple words, could perform basic arithmetic, and possessed a kind of linguistic precision that suggested he would eventually become quite eloquent. More significantly, Eleanor and James had developed a relationship of genuine affection, tempered by the kind of sibling rivalry that seemed entirely appropriate for children of their respective ages and temperaments. Eleanor, as the older child, had assumed something of a protective role, while James seemed to regard his sister with the kind of admiring exasperation that suggested he recognized her superiority in certain domains, while maintaining his own quiet confidence in areas where he excelled. Between Eleanor's 7th year and the present moment, Sophie had given birth to 2 additional children. A daughter, Catherine, now 3 years old, who seemed to be evolving into a child of considerable charm and social capability, very much in the mold of her mother, but with something of her father's commanding presence. And a son, William, who at 18 months old was still in those early stages of development where personality emerges gradually from the basic functionalities of infancy. The household at Meridian Hall had evolved to accommodate the expanding family. Additional staff had been hired. The nursery wing had been reorganized to provide appropriate spaces for children of different developmental stages, and the entire structure of the household had been arranged around the recognition that children, plural, multiple, requiring different things at different moments, were the central organizing principle of family life. What struck the Duke most profoundly, observing his household 5 years into his marriage to Sophie, was how thoroughly his understanding of what mattered had been transformed. He had once believed that the primary purpose of marriage and family was the perpetuation of property and the transmission of the family name. He now understood that these considerations, while not insignificant, were far less important than the daily creation of an environment in which human beings could flourish. Sophie had become, over these 5 years, something approaching a legendary figure in her circles. She had expanded her involvement in charitable work, had become a vocal advocate for education reform, particularly regarding the education of girls, and had managed to do all of this while remaining entirely devoted to the care and development of her children. She seemed to operate according to a principle of integration, rather than compartmentalization. Her work in the world and her devotion to family were not competing concerns, but rather complementary expressions of her commitment to creating a better world. It was on a particular autumn afternoon, autumn having become the season most associated with significant moments in their relationship, that Sophie and the Duke found themselves alone together in the conservatory, the specific location having become something of a sacred space for them over the course of their marriage. "Do you remember," Sophie asked, "the woman I was when you first proposed to me? The woman who believed her life was essentially over?" "I remember," the Duke replied. "But I also remember seeing beneath that resignation the possibility of someone quite extraordinary. I remember believing that if I could provide the circumstances in which that person might emerge, I would have accomplished something worthwhile." "You provided far more than circumstances," Sophie said quietly. "You provided genuine regard. You provided recognition of my worth. You provided partnership, rather than merely benevolent authority. Without those things, the circumstances alone would have been insufficient." The Duke moved to stand beside her at the window, from which could be observed the gardens that had become, over 5 years, increasingly refined through Sophie's careful attention and imagination. "I have been thinking," he said, "about the question of legacy that we have discussed so many times over the course of our marriage. I have come to recognize that the legacy I will leave, the only legacy that actually matters, is not the estates or the title or the accumulated wealth, though those things will be preserved and transmitted. The legacy I will leave is the example we have created together of what genuine partnership looks like, of what genuine love looks like, of what genuine commitment to another person's development and flourishing looks like. And Eleanor and James and Catherine and William will be that legacy. Sophie replied. "They will move through the world embodying the recognition that other people are full human beings, worthy of respect and genuine regard. They will teach their own children what we have taught them. The impact will extend forward in ways we cannot anticipate or measure. You have transformed my understanding of what is possible," the Duke continued. "When Eleanor, my first wife, died, I believed that the best years of my life were behind me. I believed that I could look forward only to diminishment and withdrawal. Instead, I found you, and you have taught me that transformation is possible at any age, that partnership can deepen and grow, that love is not a finite resource but something that expands through sharing." Sophie reached over and took his hand, a gesture that had become so habitual between them that it seemed almost like an extension of breathing. "You gave me the greatest gift," she said. "You gave me myself. You gave me the opportunity to discover who I actually was beneath the layers of resignation and acceptance of limitation. You gave me the chance to become fully myself. That gift has changed the trajectory of my entire existence." They stood together in the autumn light, two people who had begun their marriage from practical necessity and who had, through genuine commitment and willingness to be vulnerable with each other, created something that transcended its origins. They had built genuine partnership. They had built genuine family. They had demonstrated through their daily choices and their ongoing commitment that love was not something that happened to people, but rather something that people actively chose to create and sustain. In the distance, they could hear the sounds of their children. Eleanor and James engaged in some sort of animated discussion regarding the nature of cloud formation, Catherine laughing at something that her older sister had said, William babbling in that particular manner of toddlers who are practicing the sounds that would eventually become language. "I would not change anything," Sophie said finally. "Not the desperation that made me accept your proposal, not the fear that characterized my early months as Duchess, not the challenge of pregnancy and childbirth, not any of the difficult moments that constitute the lived experience of building a genuine partnership. All of it, every moment of difficulty and every moment of joy has led to this, and this is extraordinary." The Duke pulled her close, and Sophie rested her head against his shoulder, and they stood together in the conservatory, the place where they had conducted their most important conversations, the place where they had learned to truly see each other, the place where they had discovered that genuine love could emerge from even the most unlikely of circumstances. Outside, autumn continued its relentless transformation of the landscape. The leaves were turning to gold and crimson. The earth was preparing for winter. The cycle of seasons continued, as it had continued for millennia, indifferent to the particular human stories being lived within its framework. But inside the conservatory, two people who had been brought together by circumstance had chosen to create something genuine. And that something, that partnership, that commitment, that love, would extend forward into the future, through the children they had created together, through the example they had established, through the recognition they had created that genuine partnership and genuine love were possible when two people chose to see each other clearly and to commit to building something real together. The young woman who had wept for her lost youth had become a woman who was profoundly grateful for the unexpected life she had been given, and the man who believed he had experienced the full arc of human emotion and connection had discovered that love, genuine love, was capable of transformation and expansion at any moment of life when one was willing to be vulnerable enough to permit it. Their story was not ending. It was continuing, unfolding, evolving with each passing day. But the fundamental arc, from desperation to joy, from resignation to active choice, from isolation to genuine partnership, had been completed, and the legacy they were creating would outlast both of them, extending forward into the future, through the children they loved and the example they had established of what genuine human connection could accomplish. Dear viewers and cherished listeners of Victorian Romance audio stories, thank you for spending these precious hours with us, accompanying Sophie and Richard on their extraordinary journey from desperation to joy, from practical arrangement to genuine partnership. Their story reminds us of something essential, that love is not merely something that happens to us, but something that we actively choose to create through vulnerability, commitment, and genuine regard for another person. Eleanor and Richard's marriage began from necessity, but became genuine through their willingness to see each other clearly and to build something authentic together. In a world that often tells us that we must be perfect, that we must have everything figured out before we can deserve love, their story offers a different message, that transformation is possible, that partnership can deepen across seemingly impossible distances, that the greatest gifts often come from the most unexpected sources. We invite you to continue this conversation. Like this video if Sophie and Richard's story touched your heart. Comment below with your thoughts. Which moment moved you most? Do you believe in second chances? Have you experienced unexpected transformation in your own life? Share this video with someone who needs to hear that genuine love is possible. Subscribe to our channel so you don't miss future stories of love, transformation, and the courage it takes to build genuine partnership. Your comments and engagement help us understand what stories matter to you, what truths resonate with your hearts. This channel exists because stories of love and transformation matter. They remind us of our capacity for growth, our capacity for genuine connection, our capacity to build meaningful lives with the people we choose to love. The next extraordinary love story awaits you. Don't miss it. Subscribe now and ring the notification bell so you're notified the moment we release our next Victorian romance. Thank you for being part of this community. Thank you for believing that love stories matter. Thank you for reminding us, through your viewership and engagement, why we do this work. With gratitude and affection, Victorian Romance, audio stories, where love transcends circumstance and partnership transforms everything.